The I'd like to introduce the commissioners, staff, starting on my left.
Aaron Ryder, Columbus.
Lauren Quayle Sill, Hutchison.
I'm Gerald Lauber from Topeka.
Troy Sporer, Oakley.
Gary Hazlett, Lakin.
Emmerich Cross, Kansas City.
Sheila Camus, Commission Support.
Jason Dixon, CIO.
Brad Lovelace, Secretary.
Mike Miller, Assistant Secretary, Pratt.
And I believe Chris Tymason is on also. Chris?
It's Tymason, Legal Counsel.
Can't hear you yet, Chris, but we're getting there.
You were muted. Glad to see you made it back.
Thank you.
Okay. Do we have any additions or deletions to the agenda item, Sheila?
Yes, there is a revised agenda at the back. In the briefing book, I put Ben Neely's presentation as youth mentor fishing locations. Doug is covering that in his fishing regulations. Ben will be covering overview of length and crew limits as a fisheries management tool. And that will be in the same location, number 3. The agendas at the back are correct.
Okay, so Doug is handling youth mentor fishing locations,
Correct.
and Ben is handling what?
His is overview. Let me see, overview of length and creel limits as a fisheries management tool. It's wrong in your briefing book, but there are some at the back if you'd like me to go get them.
So, no, that's all right. And
It's number 3.
It's number 3.
Yes.
Okay. Could I have a motion that we approve the minutes?
I so move.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded that the minutes of the previous meeting be approved as is written. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay. At this point in time, we will have comments from the public on non-agenda items. Before we get to Zoom participants, of which I think there are a couple, is there anybody in this room that would like? Well, then, okay. Jason, we have some Zoom participants that wish to speak.
Yes, Brad Max will speak.
All right.
Meet you, Brad. There you go.
Okay. Can you hear me? Can I get a thumbs up or something to indicate that you, all right. Thank you. Thank you also for the work the commission does on parks throughout the state. My name is Brad Max, and I live in Kansas City, Missouri, and have camped at Cedar Point in Milford State Park for 7 years. Not continuously, but off and on many times. I want to thank Linda Lanterman and Nadia Reimer for providing information on the reconstruction project at Cedar Point. A group of us are very interested in the reconstruction of Cedar Point because we consider it one of the best campgrounds around. We return to it whenever we can to enjoy the shoreline camping sites, especially on the west, the spectacular sunsets, great fishing, and more. We're aware that there are challenges of funding and design to the project, but we hope to see the camping sites restored much as they were before the flooding of 2018, with shoreline sites along the water on the west, the original sites further up the hill, and the sites on the east. Linda and Nadia have been helpful in sending us concept designs and patiently receiving our input on the project back and forth over the last 2 years. We think that you would agree that public projects deserve public input all along the way, so that the end result will be something that everyone can support. The last we heard, which was 2 months ago, the department was working with 2 federal agencies and KDHE to get approvals for the Cedar Point reconstruction project. We assume that the approvals being sought are of something, a design concept, plans, something, but we haven't been able to get what that is. Once again, we're asking to see whatever design it is that is the subject of the requested approvals. If we wait until the approval process is complete, as has been suggested, it will be too late for the public to have any effective input. So we are asking to see the design concept or plans that the department has from working with the federal agencies and KDHE as of mid-April. If there are more recent design concepts or plans, we would like to see those as well. In our view, Cedar Point is a jewel of the Kansas park system, which says a lot, in large part because of the west-facing shoreline camping sites. I camped there last week and heard that from other campers who were there. We want to help the department restore the campground in a way that most benefits the public. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to let Linda Lanterman respond to that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Brad Max. You and I have talked many times, and we do not have that final design yet, but we have put to the engineers your concept. I just have not seen the final design. And you have to keep in mind the approvals, we have to get approvals no matter whether we have a final design or not. So we're trying to work on those before we even get that final plan. And it went back to the engineers. I don't have it yet, but as soon as I do, it will not only, you can see it, but we have others that are reviewing that besides just you. So thanks for your comment.
Thank you, Linda.
Thank you, Brad. Okay, Jason, is there somebody else?
Yeah, we got Jackie Augustine now. I'll unmute you.
Hello. Thank you for accepting my question. I'm Dr. Jackie Augustine. I'm the Executive Director for Audubon of Kansas. As you know, there's a statute, the 1903 statute, that allows counties to poison prairie dogs on private landowners' land and then charge the landowner for it. And there's also a plan that was proposed by KWPT in 2002, the Kansas Black-tailed Prairie Dog Conservation and Management Plan. I was just wondering if there's been any movement on prairie dog conservation and management in Kansas.
Well, I don't have an answer. Does any staff member want to respond to that?
Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
Yeah, Brad Lovelace, Secretary. Yeah, we have had a lot of conversations on that, both in the non-game but also one of the things, we've been talking with Fish and Wildlife Service as well as Kansas Farm Bureau, Kansas Livestock Association, and what we're planning, in fact, I'm trying to plan it right now. Now that we're out of COVID, we're close to plan a trip in the fall because Colorado has had a different experience with prairie dog management and black-footed ferret, and so we're planning a trip out there with any stakeholders that want to go from Kansas to go and talk with our counterparts in Colorado to find out about their experience and how they manage that. We've also, I was talking last Saturday with everybody to be invited to go so we can learn how they're doing things out there and see if there's some things that we can incorporate here in Kansas because they have a less contentious approach to this and we've achieved in Kansas. So we're hoping to learn from them and advance this cause because we definitely understand that Prairie dogs are a keystone species on the prairie, and black-footed ferrets are part of a healthy, population. So we're trying to advance that subject.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other Is there anybody with their hands up, Jason?
Doesn't look like it, sir.
Well, okay, thank you. Let's move on. The agency and state fiscal report. Brad?
Yes, sir. Brad Lovell, Secretary. So in terms of our fiscal status, things are pretty rosy right now for Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks, and Tourism. We finished the 2021 legislative session in good shape in terms of budget. We maintained our submitted budget. There was one change, which was minimal, but it's significant to me. There was $50,000 that the state water plans, Kansas Water Authority recommended come from that fund to fund aquatic nuisance species work. Currently, we spend $200,000 a year on all our aquatic nuisance species work to try to minimize comes to fisheries, but it's also enormous in terms of any public water supply users drinking water as well as industrial water, and yet nobody else in the state spends any money except for you folks who are buying licenses, right? And that's imbalanced. And so we've made that point with them. They agreed that money should be put in. When it made it to the legislature took it out of their budget and said the agency has to pay it. So now all $250,000 will come from license buyers and none from drinking water users or industrial. So we'll try that again. However, that was a small change. Our EDIF lottery apportionment will go down to just over $3.5 million because as tourism moves back to commerce, they'll take that apportionment that we gave them in order that they could get healthy when we were here, when they came to us. We'll allow them to take that back with them. So they'll be healthy when they get to commerce. Our park fee funds in the state parks revenue finished fiscal year 2020 up from 2019, about 36%. So that was good news. And since then, we've seen an increase from last year every month up to and including this month. So every month this year has been an increase over last year. So last year was a good year. This year is even better. So very positive. And this year we had our second highest May revenues on records. Just over $1.7 million. So our park staff are doing a great job of making their facilities very attractive. People appreciate those and they're coming out in droves. Cabin revenue is also up 10% from the previous year. Wildlife fee fund was up overall about 22% from this time last year. So again, a really good picture. Our balance at the end of May, fiscal year 20 was just shy of $22 million, but our current balance at the end of May is just over $34 million. So a significant jump. Federal funds, we expect as we look into the future, given so those taxes that come back to us and that we can leverage as long as we have enough state money that we've earned to get those are looking better than before because of those higher sales. So we expect our Pittman Robertson to go up about $1.7 million, and Dingle Johnson, our fishing funds, we expect to go up just under $1 million from $5 to almost $6 million. So all the news there is good, continues to be good. Our folks are excited and energized, try to do some things they haven't had funding to do in the past. The last comment I'll make is we do have to leverage those federal funds with our own funds. So we'll again be working with the legislature next session to try to get those fee caps raised. And we're trying to figure out an effective way to make that argument with them. And we'll definitely engage our constituent groups around the state to make sure their legislators know their opinion on the need for those increased fee funds. So that concludes my report, Mr. Chair.
I have a question for you, and you may just have a brief thought about it. The ammunition inventory. Consequently, I'm assuming that's leading to dramatically reduced sale of ammunition from which the Pittman-Robinson tax is attached. Do you think that will have any material effect on us and other states?
So my understanding, we might have staff that's better engaged in this, and if we do, I'd love to have them chime in. My understanding is production is up as high as it's ever been when it comes to ammunition. It's just flying off the shelves. They can't keep it. So I think sales remain high. One of our concerns, Mr. Chair, frankly, is that it we're hoping that there's enough out there. We know people have been buying larger amounts when they can find it. They tend to hoard it. So we're hoping that there's enough out there that people can still go hunting and that that's not a detriment to that. But the sales are going on at very high levels, but the supply hasn't caught up to the demand.
Well, that's probably part of my second question. We try to get a lot of youth to hunt, and if we wanted to go squirrel hunting, for example, with a young person with a .22 rifle, good luck on finding any ammo. Like me and other hoarders, I probably got enough to last my lifetime. But if you wanted to go buy a box, you couldn't find it.
Right.
Same way if you want to buy a box of routine 20 gauge shells for waterfowl, you can't find them.
Right. Or does anybody else on staff, our folks are so engaged in this, does anybody have any update to shed more light on this issue?
I'd be reiterating the same thing you said, Brad.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks, Jake.
Any other questions for Secretary Lovelace? Well, thank you. Let's move on to the 2021 legislature. Christopher?
Mr. Chairman, Chris Tymason. I apologize for not being there in person. The airline determined that it wasn't necessary that my family come home last night, and so we slept on the floor of the Denver International Airport, if you can call it sleep, I guess. Senate Bill 142. Oh, well, in the briefing book, this is the first year of a 2-year cycle. I would consider our legislative session fairly successful. We had quite a few initiatives that we got through, and we pushed aside some things that we certainly didn't want to have happen. I'll start with Senate Bill 101, and it dealt with e-bikes, and we've talked about it quite a bit over the last couple meetings. And essentially, it would have allowed local regulation, some more specific regulation dealing with e-bikes. Had no impact on the department, though we were following it. And there were two versions, both the same, one in the House and one in the Senate, and neither of them passed. Senate Bill 142 deals with Coast Guard approved personal flotation devices, and we needed to update the statute to accommodate a change in federal law. And now we have to come back and change regulations, and I believe Dan's going to cover part of that later on today's agenda. Senate Bill 145 allowed the department to purchase Kingman, a piece of property near Kingman Wildlife Area, and the bill went through the Senate, didn't go out of the House, ultimately was placed into an appropriations bill, and we'll be able to now purchase that piece of property after 5 years of trying. Senate Bill 159, it's joint claims against the state, has a little provision in there dealing with paying back an individual for $16,001 in relation to a piece of, or a set of antlers, also in that conference committee report. That was where the Kingman land purchase was. Senate Bill 160 updates references to the AFS guidelines and statute in relation to illegal commercialization. That passed, and at the time that I had drafted this, it was still in conference committee, I think. Senate Bill 225, KPNF, would have placed our law enforcement officers into the Kansas Police and Fire Retirement Fund. That did not pass. It had a hearing and got no further action. Senate Bill 236 deals with the semi-quincentennial Kansas Commission for the United States Semi-Quincentennial. Really, that deals with now tourism as they're departing the department and moving over to commerce, but the celebration of the United States birthday. Senate Bill 269 dealt with sale dangerous regulated animals. It's a topic that we've dealt with over the last 15 years approximately. The bill had a hearing with no further action late in the session. Executive Order Reorganization Order 48 transfers the Division of Tourism from the Department of Wildlife, Parks and Tourism to the Commerce Department, and that is effective on July 1. House Bill 2025 dealt with entering private property by law enforcement officers. It started out, there was a provision that dealt with noxious weed employees of counties and was also directed at us that we couldn't go onto private property without a warrant. There was a second section that dealt with all law enforcement, sheriffs and police and KBI, that dealt with cameras and viewing private property. That bill moved out of committee, but as it moved out, it got onto the House floor, got sent back to committee. They struck the second section of the bill and the portion dealing with noxious weed employees, sent it back out, and then it died on the House floor. It would have prevented law enforcement officers of the department from going on private property without a warrant. 2032 dealt with the use of artificial light and would have repealed essentially our night hunting coyote regulations. That did not see any action. 2087 deals with rigs, and certainly we do a lot of regulations. It would have changed the process up, which is the most important provision related to the department, in order to streamline it. That bill made it out of the Senate, out of House committee, and then is still on the House floor. It is an exempt bill, or on the Senate floor. Senate Bill 2089 was a bill that saw action late in the session. It was a gut and go, so it went into a bill and became a substitute bill. It would have required that if schools were going to use firearm safety education in middle school, you could either use Eddie Eagle or KWPT Hunter Ed programs. In high school, it had to be KWPT Hunter Ed programs. That bill passed the House, passed the Senate, and then went to the governor where it was vetoed. 2263 we covered on e-bikes. 2284 would have given 50% discount for seniors at campsites and cabins for state parks, saw no action. 2231 would have provided landowner and tenant transferable deer permits. That had a hearing in the House, but saw no further action. 2336 would have made it unlawful to shoot a deer decoy or a wildlife decoy under the supervision of law enforcement, made that a penalty as well as the other penalties that could be written for such a violation. That did pass the House committee and was stricken from the House calendar. And 2392, lifetime licenses would have been provided for any Kansas Army Air National Guard veteran with 20 years and who was honorably discharged, 20 years of service, that had a hearing and saw no further action. And I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
I have a question. Back on Senate Bill 159, the claim for $16,000, was that added into the bill?
That how joint claims bills usually work is there is a process. They come to a joint claims committee. Individuals can file claims, and then the joint claims committee has to recommend those claims for approval. In this particular case, on this particular claim, it was filed at the joint claims committee. That they did not approve it, and then it was added in the House Appropriations Committee.
So for us to get the Kingman land purchase, we were asked to pay an extortion fee of $16,000. That's my words, not yours.
No comment, Mr. Chairman.
I understand. But the $16,000 has been paid or will be paid.
That's correct. It will be paid. I just got back from family vacation, so I don't know if it went out this last week or not.
Does everybody understand what that $16,000 is?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Anybody else have any questions for Counselor Tymason?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
before we move on to the general discussion, if I may interrupt and do a quick presentation, could I do that?
Certainly.
Thank you. This won't take long, but it's a deserved recognition. I have a 30-year service award for somebody you all know and have known for many years. She's the one that gets stuff done when we need stuff done. So I first met Sheila, I think, when she came on as a part-time in information and education. Is that right, Sheila? Seems like a lot of our best people came out of information and education.
I was working half-time in fisheries too.
Okay. So I do have a 30-year service award. I'd really like to give it to you here in front of this group and tell you how much we appreciate what you do for us every single day. A lot of times, when people do things every day on a regular basis, we take it for granted. And we can count on Sheila, and I count on her a lot. So, and I think the rest of the commission also knows that too. So she's a huge asset to our agency in a lot of ways.
Come on over, Sheila. Congratulations, Sheila.
Thank you. No, I'm not tired yet.
Are there any other questions for Chris on any of the legislative issues? If not, let's move on to Kent Fricke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. We'll start today with introducing our general discussion items for the 2022-2023 turkey regulations. And I do have a presentation that Jason has up now that we'll move through. I promise I'm trying to push the button, Jason. Is it moving? No.
Is it going now?
No, got it. Thank you. So just a quick overview of the expected recommendations that we'll be making here during 2021, starting with today's general discussion. First, as always, we'll be talking about the 2023 season dates. as well as the 2022 spring and fall bag limits. But additionally, this year, we'll be talking about the youth season eligibility definition and handguns as legal equipment during our turkey seasons. So begin with our turkey season date recommendations that we'll be making this year. Just a quick overview, as you're all familiar, for the spring season, currently the youth disabled season begins April 1st. They get a weekend. Archery begins the Monday after that weekend. And then the regular season, which includes all legal equipment, begins the Wednesday after that second full weekend. So youth disabled gets a weekend, archery gets a weekend. In fall, beginning in 2020, all legal equipment is allowed, and the season runs from October 1st through November 10th. So 2022 spring turkey seasons have already been set through last year's process, and this is what the and then the regular season starts April 13th. And then, of course, the fall season this year or next year would be the same October 1st through November 10th. And so what we'll be looking forward to and discussing this year will be for 2023. And this is how that falls out if no changes are made. And again, you see the youth disabled weekend, which I will note, this is in 2023, if no changes are made, this will be as early as the regular season can start, April 12th. And if you'll recall, a couple of years ago, we had a discussion where after this round and cycle of the calendar year, we then kind of take a bigger step back to where it's the third Wednesday, and we can have that discussion about what it looks like after 2023. But just a reminder that after 2023, if no changes occur, we will. Of course, again, the fall is currently at the October 1st through November 10th season dates. Moving in briefly to some turkey season updates. At today's meeting, I'm just presenting overall license sales numbers, just to move through things relatively quickly. At our next commission meeting for the workshop session, I will be presenting more population level and harvest levels that we've been seeing, and I'll report those then. In general, we continue to see the relatively, just a slow decline of the fall turkey season. This is the number of permits by residency, and of course the residents on the top in the solid line and non-residents on the bottom in the dashed line. And just to note, because the e-licensing and e-tag option was first available for the fall 2020 season, we did see that 216 hunters used their e-licensing app to tag turkeys during the fall season. Flipping to the spring side of things, a little bit more information here. Again, the season dates on the top left. Again, note that 2020 was the first year that we had the reduced bag limits in units 3, 5, and 6, the Northeast, South Central, and Southeastern units in the state. You'll see that I'll give a little more detail on the number of permits being sold on the bottom left. And I will note that we did see one was shot in the hand by another hunter. And looking at those, and so this is the same table that I presented last year, just updated from 2020 to 2021. And I'll note a few key differences here in that the overall number of permit buyers was up by 32%. And as a reminder, during 2020, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the governor issued an executive order that suspended the sale of non-resident turkey permits for the spring season for the majority of the regular season. And so we saw a bump back from that. In terms of residents, from 2019 to 2020, we actually saw an increase of about 10% in our resident permit buyers. But this year we dropped back down about 13.8% from those 2020 numbers. And we'll get into that on the next slide a little bit more. And then, of course, as expected, our non-resident permit buyers skyrocketed from last year, but as you'll see, it is about what we would expect. And then again of note, this was the first spring season that e-licensing and e-tagging was available for turkeys, and 12,180 hunters used e-licensing to tag their turkey. There was certainly more than that used. So for example, this only counts one hunter, whether they harvested and tagged one bird or two birds, but these are the individual hunters that utilized that opportunity. And so, as I mentioned, this is the graph showing the last 10 years in licensed sales by residency.
Electronic version.
And you'll see in 2020 the big dip, especially in our non-residents, the slight increase in residents. And so from this, I would say that in terms of our overall trend in licensed sales for residency, we're back on track to where we were in 2019 and before. I think our trends are following very similar patterns as what they did before 2020. So moving now to the youth permit and season age definitions. And as was discussed earlier this year in various commission meetings, the department is trying to standardize as much as age definitions. Currently for turkeys, the youth permit eligibility, we cannot change. That's who can purchase a youth permit. That'll stay the same at 15 and under. But the recommendation, as with other game species, is going to be for youth season eligibility. And so this is what age can you be to participate in what's designated as that youth season. And so currently for turkeys, that's 16 and under, but we will be recommending a change to 17 and under to get that standardized with the other game species. And our final topic, last year during the process, turkey process with the commission, we were requested to review the potential for handguns as legal equipment during our turkey seasons. Currently, the language in the regulation reads that we explicitly do not allow handguns as legal methods of take in either the spring or fall turkey seasons. Over the winter, I did a survey of other state biologists to see what other states were allowing in terms of handgun use. And of course, there's a lot of variation, but to put it in general terms, 15 currently allow handguns to be used during the turkey season. And of note, 4 of those are only in the fall. So those 4 do not allow handguns to be used during the spring season. And 21 do not allow handguns to be used in either season, including Kansas. In terms of surrounding states, Missouri does not allow handguns, Nebraska does, and then both Oklahoma and Colorado are 2 of those 4 that currently allow it for the fall season, but not for the spring season. In general discussions with both the Turkey Committee, with other state biologists, and people who know that we were reviewing this regulation and have reached out, in general, there's kind of 2 categories of concerns. One is the lethality related to the distance of shots. And so, as we know, that handguns come in a variety of barrel lengths primarily, and certainly you can, in many modern handguns, can shoot a 410 shot shell out of some of these handguns. But there has been some concerns raised about the lethality related to how far you are from that bird and concerns about wounding loss. On the other side, there's the potential use for increased use by handicapped and youth hunters. As an example, if you're a disabled hunter or even just a recently injured hunter that still wants to get into the field, but you need to use crutches to get to try to shoulder a shotgun to get into the field. Of particular interest that I wanted to share with everyone, the state of Washington is currently also examining these similar regulations and the potential to expand legal methods of take to include handguns, and working with their state NWPF chapter they've proposed, they have not finalized this, but they've proposed the following language, which notably talks about the use of modern or muzzleloading style handguns, but they identified a minimum barrel length of 10 inches to overcome some of those potential concerns with lethality and the potential for wounding loss. So I wanted to share that just as an example of what's also going on in some other states. And so to wrap up my slides for the turkey regulations, the spring turkey harvest survey is out, as it always is. It ends June. Committee meeting, which meets internally. We'll be meeting, looking at those data, looking at our harvest strategy, looking at each of the topics we've discussed here. And at the next commission meeting in the workshop session on August 5th, I'll be presenting information on population trends, the fall and spring harvest estimates, and then our recommendations that we'll be making to the commission. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Okay, well, I have a couple questions. Of course, my data you've compiled so far, it appears like that fall turkey season is probably not going to be a material factor as far as any numbers being taken. I think there's even less than there was before. We'll see what the statistics bear out. I find that interesting. I guess that's really the only comment I might have myself. Is there any Come on up, please. Even though I know who you are, introduce yourself.
Oh, sure. Hi, this is Chris Kobach, and pleasure to be with you in person this time. We talked about this briefly in the November meeting, which was, I think, almost entirely by Zoom, so it's nice to be back to normal. I brought a little bit of information on this topic, including one of the newer forms of handguns. Now, it is case unloaded. I'm going to blame Chris Thomason. He suggested I bring the show and tell to you, but in case technically it's, I know you're not supposed to have firearms in the building, but I did want to show you, this is a Magnum Research big frame revolver, and it's choked in a medium choke. Just to give you an idea, and I think the chamber is 3 inches, and I believe the barrel is 8 or 9, but this will give you a sense of what the evolving firearms are. So it's kind of like handguns have evolved over the last 2 decades as a method for taking deer, and the deer handguns have increased in variety of chambering and the ammo being designed for it. Similarly, shotgun handguns are something that's evolving now. At first, it was just sort of like the judge in a personal defense. Now they're evolving into a hunting gun, and Magnum Research has got a very specialized 410 handgun for hunting, and it's choked in a modified choke. And one of the issues that was definitely correctly brought up is, of course, lethality, because if you don't have a choked barrel and it's a very short barrel, then it's just going to spread the pattern really wide. But that particular gun, I went ahead and patterned for you guys just because I needed something to do last night. And just to give you some data. So at 15 yards in a 3-inch, 7.5 shell with 11/16 of shot, 11/16 ounces, 15. A lot of the 410 rounds these days are using the tungsten, where you can shoot a much smaller 9 shot, and you get much more in the circle. In fact, my daughters have been hunting with TSS in a 20 gauge this past year, and it's phenomenal. Huge lethality all the way up to 60 yards. So anyway, but just even without the TSS round, even without the 9, it's got a pretty dense pattern, pretty similar to what you'd see in a 410 longer gun.
Does this gun, Chris, one state had a 10-inch barrel. How long is the barrel on this gun?
I can't remember. That state said 10-inch inclusive of the chamber. That would definitely be 10 inches inclusive. It might be 11 inclusive of the chamber. I mean, I would definitely urge you guys to move forward with the locking.
How far away was
this? 15 yards. But you could, one way to do it might be to have a similar minimum length. Another way to do it is simply to say that 410 should be the minimum sized, because there are, of course, some handguns loads you can get for personal defense where they put, really tiny shot in a normal hand, and those aren't intended for hunting, whereas this is intended for hunting. So, I don't know. It's probably 11 inches if you include the chamber in that one.
In a somewhat cursory look of what's available out there, certainly, I believe this one does, and then certainly the Thompson Center contender is the other one that there was at least two.
And I believe this is the industry, both of these, the Thompson Center one and the research one, are fairly recent additions to the lineup. And so I think that the industry's moving in this direction. We'll probably see more coming out into the market, especially as states begin to realize this is, if you choke a handgun and chamber at 410, it functions pretty much like a 410 long gun. So, but if there are any other questions you have, it's pretty interesting. You can I actually have shot clay pigeons thrown in the air with that too, which is pretty fun, pretty not easy, but the point is they're developing shotgun-like handguns.
But your daughters aren't using this.
They are not using that, but it actually would be a very good, if I had an arm and a sling or something and I had an injury and I wanted to hunt, or if I were disabled, it would actually work pretty well.
The weight on that is immense for youth, for women, for some upper extremity disabilities.
Yeah, and they designed it that way to reduce kicking.
Sure.
Any other questions for Chris?
I would just encourage you guys to go ahead and move forward with the rate change, and hopefully for the rest of later this year. Thank you.
Is there any other comments from either the commission or yes?
Ken, that turkey committee, who is that? Who is that comprised of?
Yeah, so the Turkey Committee was formed, I guess, I'm not sure, 15, 20 years ago. And it's an internal committee composed of public lands, private land and wildlife division. I coordinate the chair of the committee, and we have a law enforcement representative, and then we have the district biologist from National Wild Turkey Federation on there. And basically the way I've designed the committee membership now is that for each of the units, we have both a wildlife division, so private lands, and a public lands representative for each of the units. And then a statewide representative for law enforcement, and then obviously the NWTF for health.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have a, kind of like what we're talking about with iSportsman, do we have like a video, a how-to video on how to tag, e-tag these turkeys and deer? I had a few comments during that time period. The guy called me up and was like, yeah, on the app. Do we have anything like that at this point yet?
Commissioner Ryder, I do believe we do. Jason Ott, our former law enforcement division director, had produced one, and I think our current license vendor has one as well. So we do have a couple of different versions on there to show people how to use the e-app, the e-tagging.
And is that on YouTube or is that on the department website?
Yep.
Just anecdotally, I had a number of calls as well from hunters in the field that had just shot a turkey and couldn't figure out, and a number of those just they had not or otherwise, and just either never got it or never actually they downloaded it but never logged in. Those kind of things, and so which, as with any new technology, I think people get used to it and figure those out.
It may be good, I don't know, this is just me thinking right now, to see if we can put that on, maybe that those how-to videos out a month or two, maybe on the Facebook page or something like that, just so it's right there on people's minds before season begins. That's just me thinking out loud right now.
I think the right folks are here to take note of that up there. Megan and Jessica from Public Affairs are here. We'll make a note of that. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions or comments for Kent? You want to move into lesser prairie chicken?
Yeah, Jason, can you go to the next presentation, please? Perfect. All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As many folks are aware, the department has been quite involved with lesser prairie chicken conservation and management for a number of years. And so with some recent developments, especially on the federal side of prairie chicken conservation management, we thought it prudent to give a brief update on what we as a department do and just kind of the current status of lesser prairie chickens, especially within Kansas. And so a few of the topics I'm going to cover today is just a real brief overview of what is a lesser prairie chicken. As many people are maybe aware and seen in the news, making some headlines, the Fish and Wildlife Service recently proposed the lesser prairie chicken for listing. Of conserving lesser prairie chicken, and then focus a lot on some of the current and past research of lesser prairie chickens in Kansas. And so lesser prairie chickens occur across a 5-state region, including Kansas, Colorado, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Texas. And of that, the majority of the population is actually in western Kansas. As you'll note there's a few different colors going on. The larger boundary is the historic range of the lesser prairie chicken, which of course they don't cover that much area now. And each of the different colored types throughout the range. And so starting in the southwest, we have the Shinnery Oak down in New Mexico. Into the panhandle of Oklahoma and then the panhandle of Texas. To the west, we have the Sand Sage Prairie ecoregion with primarily in southeastern Colorado. In western Kansas and extreme eastern Colorado, we have the shortgrass prairie and CRP mosaic ecoregion. So that's the general distribution and current distribution of lesser prairie chickens throughout the southern Great Plains. Lesser prairie chickens, as many of us are probably most aware, we see them in the spring doing their mating rituals, which is a great sight to see, and I always encourage people to see and hear them. But in March and April, the lesser prairie chickens in western Kansas do a mating ritual and a dancing ritual to compete for breeding rights on what are called leks in the prairie, where again the males compete and the females choose which males to breed with. And one of the primary issues that we try to manage for on the landscape is nesting habitat. Nesting habitat throughout the lesser prairie chicken range is one of the primary limiting factors to lesser prairie chicken populations. And in general, we talk about the need for shin to hip high grass or shrub cover that lesser prairie chickens need. Overall population trends hit an all-time low in 2013. So as many are aware, annually we complete aerial surveys using helicopters throughout the lesser prairie chicken range to develop these population estimates. And so on the left, you see the range-wide population estimates from 2012 to 2020. And then on the right, you see the different ecoregions and what the trends look like within each of those. And so in general, in Kansas, the shortgrass prairie in western and northwest Kansas looks really good, and we continue to see really important increases in the shortgrass population. The mixed grass in south central Kansas is relatively stable, and then we've seen some pretty good declines in the sand sagebrush ecoregion in southwest Kansas and southeastern Colorado. And the lesser prairie chicken has a long and storied history, and in this regard, the timeline here is talking specifically about with federal overlap with federal and potential federal protections. And so actually, I forgot one. In 1973, not long after the Endangered Species Act was, of course, finalized, there was a red book put out, and the lesser prairie chicken was actually among, I believe, 70 bird species that were even in the red book at that time, which of course it didn't have, that red book didn't have any teeth in terms of regulation, but point being that, you know, for over 50 years, the lesser prairie chicken has been in the discussion at the federal level. And so you can see there some of the changes over time. Certainly things really ramped up in 2012 and 2013 in terms of state efforts to try and keep the lesser prairie chicken off the endangered species list. In 2013, as many are aware, the states finalized a range-wide conservation plan for the lesser prairie chicken. In 2014, the bird was listed by the Fish and Wildlife Service as threatened throughout its range. In 2015, after being sued in a federal court, repealed that listing. In June of 2016, the bird came off entirely, the endangered species list. But then, so that was in June 2016. In September of 2016, they were re-petitioned to be put back on the list. And so since September of 2016, again, Fish and Wildlife Service has been considering the lesser prairie chicken for listing. And then at the end of May, the Fish and Wildlife Service formally proposed to list the species under the Endangered Species Act. One of the key pieces of information that the Fish and Wildlife Service uses to inform that listing decision is the species status assessment. And this is a document that was released at the same time that the proposed listing was put out at the end of May. And overall, it describes to the best extent possible, using the best science available, the species needs, what the habitat and current conditions and current habitat are, what the current threats are, what the current conservation opportunities are. And so overall, it kind of defines the current species condition and then projects that forward in different scenarios to look at the potential future conditions that the species may be subjected to in the future. And the states, myself as a representative for Kansas, was extremely involved with the development of the species status assessment and making sure that, or helping to ensure that the Fish and Wildlife Service used the best information available. And so overall, what this document found was that in terms of species needs, not a surprise here, for those that know lesser prairie chickens, they need large, contiguous landscapes. The primary threat, according to Fish and Wildlife Service, is habitat loss and fragmentation, which of course is related to that need for large, contiguous landscapes of grass. And currently, they found that 80 to 90% reduction of the populations and available habitat from that historic range. And if you remember that larger boundary, which is pretty large, but they estimate that 80 to 90% reduction of populations from historic levels. And then as they projected future conditions, they projected that habitat loss and fragmentation is expected to continue, as well as additional impacts from threats like climate change. So those are the primary findings from the species status assessment. As I mentioned, on May 26th of 2021, the Fish and Wildlife Service released their proposed listing, and it's about a 200-page document if you'd like to take a look. But I'll try to summarize it in one slide here. And of particular note is that the Fish and Wildlife Service defined two distinct population segments. And Jason, I don't know if you can move that box a little bit, at least to the bottom left maybe for this. But so within this figure, again, you'll see that again, I apologize that I can't tell much, but the shaded areas are those different ecoregions that I mentioned earlier. And as you'll note, the Shinnery Oak down in New Mexico and western Texas is geographically separated from the remainder of the range. And so based on geographic separation as well as genetic separation, the Fish and Wildlife Service defined a breakpoint or a line between those two population segments and defined a northern population segment and a southern population segment. And that's important because the northern population segment, which includes Kansas, was proposed as threatened, but that southern distinct population segment was proposed as endangered. And so as we move through the process, the legal process here, we will be having to define which prairie chickens we're talking about through that process. But for the purposes of today, it's just really important just to know that for the population that includes Kansas, it is proposed as threatened, which was what it was also listed as back in 2014. The Fish and Wildlife Service has proposed a 4D rule, which for those who are not, including myself, ESA experts, these are the exemptions that may be considered to those prohibitions of take once a species is listed within the Endangered Species Act. And so currently, as proposed, that includes routine ag practices, as long as you do not break out additional land, so it would still be prohibited to go from native prairie, break that out and go to cultivated land or row crop agriculture. But as long as it already is in row crop agriculture, you're good to go. And then there's also an exemption within that proposed 4D rule for prescribed fire, which especially in the eastern portion of the Lesser Prairie Chicken Range, think Medicine Lodge area, the eastern portion of that mixed grass area where woody plant encroachment is increasing, the prescribed fire is an extremely important management tool for that. So that's a brief overview. Overall, there is a 60-day, and we're within this period now, a 60-day comment period that ends August 2nd that we as a department, along with our state and conservation partners, anticipate providing comment on. And there are also a couple online public information dates that the Fish and Wildlife Service has set up. And so I just wanted to point out very briefly that there always have been and there continue to be landowner and industry options for regulatory certainty. So if the species is listed, there are a number of ways that whether you're a landowner or an industry person or company, there are a number of ways that you can get that regulatory uncertainty and increase your predictability of your ability to do what you do on your own land and increase your predictability in terms of oil and gas, wind farms, any of those associated industries. So I won't go into those, but there's a number of things that we could certainly talk about if people are interested. And certainly the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks and Tourism has been extremely involved in lesser prairie chicken policy discussions as well as conservation efforts for a number of years. And one such effort, of course, is the range-wide conservation plan that I mentioned. And I'll just mention within that, there's a number of committees that are actually extremely productive and meet quite often, especially as we come up to proposed listing timelines. But the Initiative Council is the 5 state directors. So Brad is on that, and actually Secretary Lovelace chairs that council currently. George, our Wildlife Division Director, is active on the advisory committee, and that's involved with a number of the different stakeholders from across the range. Currently, I chair the Interstate Working Group, which is the 5 state biologists from throughout the range. And then each of the Interstate Working Group members and myself in Kansas chair the state implementation teams, which includes all of the relevant Kansas conservation partners that have a direct impact on lesser prairie chicken management within the state. And so we're very active in terms of trying to tailor conservation programs within the state to benefit lesser prairie chickens in the state. And of course, we continue to have ongoing private lands habitat work. Obviously, a lot of that comes from USDA Farm Bill programs, such as CRP, EQIP, but certainly our Habitat First program within the department is influential as well in terms of maintaining those landowner contacts and moving conservation efforts forward in a predominantly private landscape. And then we, of course, continue to coordinate with Fish and Wildlife Service. As an example, coordination with the species status assessment. We meet at least every month, but usually it's every 2 weeks with the Fish and Wildlife Service to coordinate at a technical level what's going on with policy and how programs might move forward in a more positive manner. Additionally, Kansas has a rich history of funding and pursuing lesser prairie chicken research. And I wanted to really briefly go over this because this is literally bookshelves worth of information. We have a really strong relationship with Dr. Dave Hokus, who is the co-op unit leader, the Kansas Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit leader at Kansas State University. And Dave has literally written a book on lesser prairie chicken management. And he and his team of graduate students and other professors at the university have been outstanding in terms of producing information to be used not only in Kansas, but throughout the lesser prairie chicken range. And so the shaded area, the darker areas, as well as many other areas are study sites that Dave and his crew have been working on in some cases since the 1980s or before, but certainly through some department funding starting back in 2011, 2013 time period. And we continue that. And some of the primary findings, and as I mentioned, he literally wrote the book. Some of the primary findings, and again, I don't think this is anything terribly surprising, but the wealth of information really backs up these statements. Again, the necessity of large, intact grassland for lesser prairie chickens to be sustainable on the landscape, the effects of climate and land cover, both the positive and negative aspects of especially land cover change, but also highlighting the negative impacts of anthropogenic features, whether that's roads, power lines, wind turbines, pump jacks, all the associated things with vertical structure in a prairie landscape, and definitely tree encroachment as well, and the negative impacts of trees on lesser prairie chicken populations. And then certainly the positive impacts of especially light to moderate grazing. Throughout the lesser prairie chicken range, grazing is essential to, one, maintaining prairie as prairie, but also it just, especially in the eastern portion of the range, where you get more precipitation, grazing is really essential to maintain those key habitat types. And it's also highlighted the importance of the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP. Throughout the range, especially in western Kansas, lesser prairie chickens are surviving because of the CRP program. It helps those populations get through drought. It serves as nesting habitat when there's just not that much else for nesting habitat on the landscape. And then that, just as one example, provides us very important tools for targeting our conservation and management efforts. And so here you see a species distribution model that predicts where lesser prairie chickens are likely to occur based on habitat within the state. And so you'll see in the blue the high concentrations there. So it tells us where the birds are. And then from that, in this example, it also tells us where tree encroachment is an issue. And so further east, you see that those higher tree canopy levels, which again tell us where to go with our brush management efforts. And then as another example, we were able to actually go to a parcel level and say this particular piece, based on the surrounding landscape, would be most beneficial if we were to enroll it in CRP, or if it's already enrolled, these are the most important parcels to keep enrolled in the program. And so based on that, we can potentially incentivize landowners to help us do lesser prairie chicken management at a landscape scale. And then finally, just wanted to highlight, hopefully real briefly here, a significant effort that the department has taken part in since 2016. In 2016, we were approached by Colorado Parks and Wildlife to specifically target some translocations down to the sand sagebrush ecoregion of southwest Kansas and southeastern Colorado. Specifically, we were looking at lesser prairie chicken populations on the Comanche National Grasslands on the Colorado side and the Cimarron National Grasslands on the Kansas side. Historically, these were very much strongholds for lesser prairie chickens, but in recent years, those numbers had dwindled quite significantly. Additionally, we're experiencing some pretty good weather conditions coming out of the 2013-14 droughts. 2016, 17, and 18 were relatively good years for precipitation. in that portion of the range. And so on the bottom left, you can see how those populations have dwindled, leading to that point. And so I'll leave this up, so I forgot to put a map in here, but basically we moved lesser prairie chickens from the northeastern portion of that, the green blob there, the shortgrass prairie ecoregion, specifically Lane, Ness, Gove counties, and moved them to the Cimarron and Comanche National Grasslands. And so the overall goals of this project were twofold. First was to increase that long-term persistence and distribution of lesser prairie chickens, so just boost the population kind of thing. But just as importantly, we wanted to assess the feasibility of translocations as a management tool for restoring populations. We felt that we weren't just going to throw out birds on landscape and hope that they did well. If they failed, if they succeeded, we wanted to know why. And so beginning in 2016, we started trapping some males in the fall of 2016, and then ramped up our efforts significantly and trapped birds up in the shortgrass from 2017 to 2019, and moved those birds down to the Cimarron and Comanche National Grasslands. We monitored them, putting VHF and GPS transmitters on them. We pulled some feathers for genetic samples. We took blood for disease testing. You know, if we can get something off of these birds, we got it. And again, there are four primary objectives in terms of the research, looking at dispersal, nest success, habitat use, and survival. And so on the left, you see the GPS transmitters. Obviously, there's a solar panel to keep batteries going. The technology that's able to be used on these birds is pretty amazing. Caught birds, released birds, and I just highlight that bottom center photo in that this truly was a collaborative effort. This, who you see here, are biologists from Kansas and Colorado. And this was actually just before we started with K-State. Otherwise, you would see graduate students in here as well. This is at 10:30 at night, figuring out who's going where. And all of these people got up at 4 in the morning to go set traps and ready to go. So a significant effort put forth by everyone involved. Overall, we moved 411 lesser prairie chickens, which makes it the largest translocation effort on lesser prairie chickens, and I believe prairie grouse ever attempted in the U.S. And you can kind of see the breakdown there. And all those birds, again, went to the Cimarron and Comanche National Grasslands. In terms of nest and brood numbers, so again, after we translocate those birds, they're marked. We're able to determine where they nest, go out and either flush, or just once that hen is moved, determine whether or not she was successful or not. Documented 140 nests, and then followed up on 98 broods over the 3 nesting seasons of the project. So did really well in terms of getting those numbers. Dispersal was significant. As you know, we had gotten from previous research, especially on greater prairie chickens, we knew that some of these hens were likely to move a lot, but I don't know that we ever would have predicted this much. As you can see, some birds literally went to Texas and then back and made loose that way. And so some of the movement analyses that the graduate students are doing on this are pretty amazing, telling us a lot about how these birds move through the landscape. Overall, and this is breaking down 4 years of research into a single slide and 2 bullet points, but overall, the need for habitat restoration and management is essential to supporting these lesser prairie chicken populations. And the research findings here support that. So we've got some specific recommendations for habitats that can be improved in and around the national grasslands down there, and certainly around private ranches and landowners in surrounding areas. And translocation efforts just will be required to be big if they were ever to be used. And so I'm certainly not proposing translocation at this point as a necessity or even a preferred management option, but this project has told us a lot in terms of the landscapes that these birds are using, how they respond to being moved, how they respond to novel habitats. And so we've really learned a lot from this that we hadn't known previously. So just acknowledge all, again, the significant efforts of all of our conservation partners on this project, but most importantly, the private landowners who we worked with to gain access to allow trapping on their properties in the shortgrass, but also down in the sand sage, who allowed us to access properties to check up on nests, find mortalities, all the associated things with field work. So with that, I'd be happy to stand for any questions, but that's the Lesser Prairie Chicken update.
Did you have to establish new leks with the translocated birds? How did that work? Would they go to the leks that were already being used by other
Yeah,
chickens?
excellent question. So the status of lesser prairie chickens in and around the national grasslands in 2016, when we started this, there was one lek on the eastern portion of the Cimarron, and I believe there's one lek that was really small on the Comanche. And so that's why we initially started with moving males the fall previously. And so we moved males in the fall with the expectation that they would survive through the winter, and then beef up those numbers on those leks or establish new leks previous to that. So that kind of sort of worked, not really. We didn't, so I believe we moved 26 males that fall. Looking back and with the numbers we have now, it probably wasn't enough to really influence where those hens, because of course in the spring, you focus on hens to move and just try to establish lekking and nesting that same spring. So it didn't really influence that much. The birds really ended up going to just whatever was the best habitat available. So the numbers had dwindled to a level that I don't think those males initially or the males afterwards were really tied to anything existing. They just searched the landscape and found the habitat that looked the best.
You have until August 2nd to make comment to the Fish and Wildlife Service. What are you going to say?
I think that we will emphasize some of the positive impacts that, or not positive impacts, but the positive trends of lesser prairie chickens, especially here in the state, especially in the shortgrass prairie. We've seen population increases and expect to see additional increases from this year. We don't have the final numbers yet, but we're expecting increases in the shortgrass prairie, which supports 75%, close to 75% of the population. So I think we'll emphasize that. We will emphasize a lot of the conservation efforts that are already available to land managers, landowners, industry that are already out there. And so just highlight the availability of tools that we currently have. I also believe that we'll emphasize the potential drawbacks of a federal listing in terms of the ability and interest of private landowners to work with us as a state agency or any other conservation partner. When you have a federally listed species, you often find that landowners aren't as willing to work with you. And so I think we'll emphasize some of that as well.
Well, I agree with everything you said, and that's sort of been my feeling from way back, whenever it was 2014 or whenever, that we would, with a voluntary, sustained effort on behalf of the state and stakeholders, we would have as much effect as having demanding federal mandates. A good rain, it produces a bunch of grasshoppers, makes the management look good. And I don't know what else you can do. That satisfies my curiosity. Is there any other questions for Ken on this? This is a complicated issue, and I don't know if you'll be successful on having it postponed and give an opportunity for us to go ahead and try to do it. Is there any questions from the public? Any questions for Kent? Well, that was a good quality, exhaustive report, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Linda?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, and the public. It's good to be back in the same room with you. Kansas State Park's been busy this year. We have no proposed changes at this time. What I would request of you, though, if you feel comfortable in getting out to a state park, our team would like to show you around, let you see the activity that's taking place, and we will be looking at regulations, though, in the future. Thank you.
Any questions for Linda? Okay. Dan? Dan Heskett, here he comes.
600 acre. Yes.
Good afternoon. Nice to see everyone in person. 2012, the United States Coast Guard notified the states that they were looking at changing the life jacket requirement and adopting the International Organization of Standardization method such as Canada uses. They term it ISO standards for their labeling of life jackets. That started a debate between the Coast Guard and the states as to the purpose of doing such, knowing that that was going to require all the states and territories to change their laws and regulations, as well as all of our educational material. In 2014, the Coast Guard adopted the changes into their Code of Federal Regulations. And since those regulations are preempted, the states had to adopt either the same language or a more restricted language into our statutes and regulations. So the states came back and said that we weren't going to do that until the Coast Guard could provide us with the method that they were going to have their jackets tested and could actually show us what the labels were going to look like and some other issues. In 17, early 18, they started providing us with the information that was requested, and recently they've started coming into the state's programs and making sure that we have adopted the language into our statutes and our regulations. Chris Thompson and I started working on this. I believe there was one statute dealing with kids under the age of 13 wearing the life jackets that we had to get some language adopted. The other, the major statute was already in place that would allow us to adopt the language by regulation and so forth. So here we are. Basically, the change is we'll be striking out the types. There'll no longer be a type 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 life jacket. It basically goes to every person on board would be required to have a U.S. Coast Guard approved wearable flotation device on board that vessel for each person. Now, one of the biggest questions we had was, so when does this make type 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 jackets obsolete? And the answer to that is never. As long as that life jacket is U.S. Coast Guard approved and it is in serviceable condition, meaning no rips, tears, all the buckles are there, zippers are in place, it will be an approved life jacket of the proper size and fit for the individual on board. The main part to this is they went to a measurement system using newtons. And on the life jacket, it's all based on the label. The life jackets, I believe there's 5 ratings. 55 is, I believe, the lowest rating. And a 55 rating life jacket will not be certified by the Coast Guard. It's more of a swimming aid. So the next level would be to a 70, and then on up, I believe 275 is the highest one. So the higher the value, the more flotation that device provides. How they come up, the science between behind the newtons and stuff, I don't know what that is. But they do. It also has a turning ability. If you see a circle with an arrow within that circle, and it has a hash mark through it, it basically means that life jacket's not designed to turn an unconscious victim over. And then the other part that's major to this jacket is they put a warning symbol down below to designate what type of activity it is not approved for. And basically you have the towing for like water skiing, which is a handlebar, like a handle with a cross through it. I called the next one, I gave them hell on this one because they said it looks like you can't roast your turkey on Thanksgiving, because to me it looks like a turkey in a roaster. But basically it is a tuber. And I'm like, how's a person supposed to know that's a tuber? It doesn't look like a tuber, but I guess somebody will explain it to them. So if it's got that symbol on there, you can't utilize it for towing a tuber. And then you got a personal watercraft, and then you got a paddle sport. Most of those labels are probably going to be put on inflatable life jackets, I would say. It really doesn't change the way things are done, it's just the label characteristic. Part of the theory behind this is that it will maybe get people to pay more attention to their life jackets and possibly wear them. That's a debate. So anyway, without going into the exact language change, which I think Chris is still working on, that's pretty much it.
Okay.
Questions?
Are there any questions for Dan? Any questions from the public? Okay. No, I don't go anywhere yet.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I got a surprise for Dan.
The executive is asked.
So it's good. I'd ask Colonel Kaiser to come on up, please. So let's step out from this. I'll just talk around. So this summer, earlier this year, this spring, Colonel Kaiser and I talked about submitting Dan for an award through WAFA. WAFA is the Association of the Western 19 U.S. states, the 5 Canadian provinces, so it's a big territory. And Dan has done so much work for our agency over his 30-plus year career that we wanted to, submit that. And the award committee of WAFA agreed with us that he was very well deserving of a special service award. And I won't read you the whole award and the whole submittal that Colonel Kaiser made. I'll read a couple of paragraphs because of all Dan's contributions. The ones that have changed us, I think, the most have been the way he has built up and guided the boating program. So I'll read a couple of paragraphs that Colonel Kaiser submitted. Through his efforts, many programs within the Kansas Department of Wildlife Parks and Tourism have seen substantial growth through the years. As the state boating law administrator, Major Heskett has provided testimony which impact boating safety. Another aspect of his duties is to oversee the annual United States Coast Guard grant funding for the agency. Before Major Heskett took the helm as the state boating law administrator, the condition of the agency's boating equipment is a new 20-foot Boston Whaler patrol boat on almost every Kansas reservoir. In addition, a great number of personal watercraft, john boats, airboats, kayaks, and canoes are spread out for the Kansas game wardens.
This program has allowed wardens to patrol the public waterways more effectively in Kansas. Wardens can also safely respond as emergency calls for service with better equipment to accomplish the mission. The efficient use of side-scan sonar units coupled with versatile boating response has increased the game warden's relevance as today's society of law enforcement. These upgrades have allowed game wardens to perform many water rescues over the years. When called for drowning cases, these upgraded platforms have allowed for expedited recovery of these victims. An expanded patrol of Kansas reservoir waters has aided in the conservation of Kansas fisheries, allowing wardens to check anglers on a much more frequent basis. So that's just a subset of what we submitted, but as I said before, the WAFA selection committee wholeheartedly agreed that Dan is in well-deserved for a special service commendation. The plaque is coming, but they asked, and I appreciate Megan videoing this, they asked that we tape this presentation, and so I would say congratulations, Major Husky. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good. I'm going to propose that we take a 10-minute break. I'd say a 5-minute break and it'll work into 10 minutes, but let's try to take a 10-minute break and keep it at 10 minutes. And Doug, kind of explain why we're switching these around.
Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, we are going to have some presentations today, a little beyond what we have normally done for our fisheries workshop. We're going to be just having a little bit of an overview of the use of regulations, particularly length and creel limits to manage fish populations, and that's what Ben is going to talk to you about. Talk about the latest use and latest and greatest ideas in the use of length and creel limits, and maybe a little bit about the history. And then we'll follow it up with an update on our walleye initiative with the length limit changes that we put in place at Cedar Bluff and Marion Reservoir. We have Dave Spalsbury and Craig Johnson going to be giving those presentations. And then when those presentations are done, I think I'll come back up and we'll finish out a discussion on the proposed rate changes for next year. So here comes Ben. Ben Ely is one of our fisheries research biologists out of the Emporia office.
All right. Doug, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, I certainly appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. This kind of came about as we get to talking about these fish harvest regulations, and there's a lot of questions about why we do what we do, what regulations apply in certain scenarios. Particular types of fish harvest regulations. I do want to preface that not all of these regulations that we have can be pigeonholed into one of these four types, but these certainly provide the framework for when we start to think about what we want to do to manage our fish populations. And I'm going to start with the question, why do we manage fish? And the answer to this is multifaceted. I mean, we want everything from creating opportunities for these easy to catch fish like bluegill. Sometimes we want to enhance populations, maybe through stockings of blue catfish. Sometimes we want to create unique angling opportunities. We have some paddlefish programs going on right now, trying to create destination fisheries. Sometimes we just want big fish. A lot of anglers will drive a long ways to catch a 10-pound bass. Sometimes we want to eat fish. You know, the crappie fishing sells licenses every spring. A lot of folks like to fill the freezer and catch a bunch of crappie. But ultimately, the reason that we manage these fish is because our constituents love them. We love to work with them, and fishing is just such an integral part of society where these people that do a lot of angling just really love these fish, and we want to do the best we can to provide them the opportunities. So in Kansas, the main way we manage is with creel limits and with length limits. I'm not going to get into creel limits. I started to kind of go down that road, and this got too long. And I'm just going to talk about length limits today, just kind of to set the stage for what we're going to talk about in a bit. And specifically, I'm going to talk about four types of length limits. I'm going to talk about minimum length limits, X over. Because a lot of times you hear these limits referred to as slot limits. And when you hear things referred to as slot limits, that defaults to a protected slot. We're going to talk about some stuff that falls towards the harvest slot line in a little bit. So I just want to kind of point out some of the differences. So starting with minimum length limits, this is when fish at or over a specified length may be harvested. And the purpose of this is to protect fish until they reach a minimum size. So this minimum size is typically reproductive size or an angler desired size. The general idea behind minimum length limits from the beginning of fisheries management was to protect these fish long enough to spawn so they could replenish the population and maintain harvest. And we commonly use those in Kansas when we're establishing a new population. The 35-inch minimum length limit on blue catfish is a very good example of this. We have the individuals in the population have rapid growth. So we know that those fish are going to get to this minimum length limit in a pretty quick amount of time. When people want to harvest these fish, we know that exploitation will be high if the fish were unregulated, basically when they taste good. When we have variable recruitment, when we don't know if there's going to be a new length limit helps preserve those fish in the population and make sure that we can get some reproductive activity. And ultimately, a lot of times a minimum length limit can be used to maximize the harvested yield. And this is our most commonly used fish harvest regulation. It's the most easily understood by angling public. It's the default length limit for our statewide regulations when we're looking at a 12-inch largemouth bass or a 15-inch walleye, for example. And the reason that is because it meets a variety of management goals. So now I want to talk about these X over length limits. And to think about this, the X can be a 1 over, a 2 over, or a 3 over. And what this means is it's a limited harvest of fish over a specified length. And the purpose here is to protect fish that have reached this large size. So oftentimes this large size is an angler-determined trophy size. It's the kind of fish that somebody wants to catch and be able to brag to their buddies about it. And it's used when fish growth and abundance supports a trophy fishery. If we know that these fish can get to 40 inches, if these blue catfish can get to 40 inches relatively quick, and there's enough of them to get there to create this fishery, this can be a good option. Are on their beds and they're readily available to anglers. When anglers prefer to harvest these large fish, a lot of anglers would rather take home, a 29-inch walleye than a 19-inch walleye. So when we get the anglers preferring to harvest these large fish, this gives us a way to protect those. And it maximizes trophy yield for catch and release angling. So we're not so much worried about the pounds of meat that an individual can take home, but the opportunities to catch these large fish. And this has been infrequently used in the past, and that's because, by and large, the fisheries management community is managed for harvest opportunities. And we have these harvest-oriented fisheries. We weren't so worried about getting some of these large fish that are driving a lot of our fisheries now with the trophy opportunities. And this increased catch and release philosophy has really kind of driven this home, and there's a lot more activity with fisheries managers thinking about how to implement these kind of X over regulations. So as I mentioned, it's to allow the harvest of a limited number of fish over a certain length. We're currently using that with our protected slot length limits with blue catfish and sunfish, where at Milford, for example, there's a 25 to 40 inch protected slot length limit on blue catfish, but only one of those in 5 fish daily bag, but only one of those 5 fish can be over 40 inches. With our sunfish, we have just a few lakes, experimental lakes, we have a 6 to 9 inch protected slot length limit, unlimited harvest under 6 inches, but only 5 fish can be kept over 9 inches. So a lot of times these X over length limits work in conjunction with a different type of regulation, including minimum length limits, where something's set up where you might have you can keep 5 fish over 15 inches, but only one of those fish can be over 21. So now I'm going to talk about these slot length limits, and I'm going to start with the protected slot. And this is what we hear most about. This says that fish within the specified length range may not be harvested. So it's a protected group of fish from a certain length range. And the purpose of a protected slot length limit is to thin overabundant small fish to try to get more big fish, essentially. A population can only support 10 pounds of fish, and we get in a situation where we'd rather have one 10-pound fish, but instead we have 10 one-pound fish. We want to get some of those 1-pound fish out of there so the other ones can grow bigger and be the size that we're trying to get to. And this can create a lot of complications determining this minimum size and maximum size, because a minimum size has to be small enough to protect these intermediate fish, but it has to be large enough that anglers will want to keep the fish. We can't get in a scenario where the lower side of these protected slots is too low. Otherwise, it's just going to serve as a minimum length limit where nothing is harvested until it gets over that maximum size. And talking about that maximum size, it has to be small enough to be attainable within the population. In other words, the fish population has to be fast growing enough, strong enough to get to these larger sizes. But it also needs to be high enough to promote these trophy fish and protect fish to open up these opportunities. And we commonly use protected slot length limits when we have consistent recruitment, meaning we know that every year we're going to get a bunch of babies produced and those fish are going to move up and into the population. And also when we see slow growth. To take that a step further, typically what we'll see is fish get to a relatively small length and then they just kind of quit growing. You see it a lot in crappie where you'll have 8-inch fish that may be 8 years old. just because they don't have enough resources to grow any larger because there's too many fish or not enough resources. And this is a graphic from every fisheries management textbook I've ever seen, but it just kind of lays out how these, or what you see with this protected slot length limit. It's just a lot of small fish that you just have to thin out so the remaining ones can get into that slot. Once they get in that slot, they typically reproduce, but they're protected, get the resources they need to get to that large size that we're trying to provide for our anglers. And when we think about protected slot length limits, we get questions about walleye all the time on these and why we don't use them. And I'm hoping to shed a little bit of light on that here. These protected slot length limits for walleye work great in northern waters for a few reasons. One, growth is really slow. Two, the waters are not nutrient rich. Our waters here have much more food available. There was one other thing, but I forgot what it was going to be. But regardless, Kansas walleyes aren't prone to slow growth. And in fact, we look at this little graph here, and this doesn't mean anything where it's at, but it does suggest that at age 4, Kansas walleye are somewhere around 19 or 20 inches. And when we look at the U.S. median, so I mean, you can think about this as the average walleye growth in the United States. Kansas fish just grow much, much, much faster to the point where if we're looking at an 18-inch fish, that fish is going to be 3 in Kansas, and the average fish in the United States is going to be 5. So we just don't have these issues with slow walleye growth. Another thing that really makes this protected slot poor for our walleye populations is we don't have consistent recruitment. And the quick answer to that is, why don't you stock more fish? And that's a great idea in theory, but even with stocked fish, we run into recruitment issues. There'll be certain situations, whether it's wind or water temperature or timing of plankton hatch, that create situations where we're just not going to get a lot of survival from these young walleye. Typically what we have in our populations is fairly large year classes that kind of drive these fisheries for a couple years, and we hope to get another one so we can continue. In Kansas are harvested. If we were to put a protected slot on walleye, fish underneath that protected slot would be harvested as soon as captured, and we just wouldn't have very many fish moving into that angler preferred size. And ultimately, we think it would result in increased harvest of small walleye, but reduced overall yield. So it would provide a scenario where folks might be able to harvest 13-inch walleye, 2 or 3 of those, where we're trying to manage for the possibility to harvest some of these larger 18 or 21-inch fish. So now I'm going to hit on harvest slot length limits, and this is something that I don't believe we have done in the state, at least not to my recollection. Length limit where we have this range where you can't keep them. Now we would want people to keep them in this range. And the idea is to focus harvest on this specified size class to try to get more small and big fish. Using that same analogy with the 10 pounds of fish and a carrying capacity, and whether you'd rather have 1 10-pound fish or 10 1-pound fish, oftentimes we want a mix of those two, where we want to have these small and the large. We don't want everything to be the same. So when we look at this harvest slot, it's typically when you get a group of fish stockpiled in this particular range, when you get fish, a bunch of fish in one size group. This can happen when there's a large year class, for example, that is really big and comes in and it just dominates the population, and it's getting all the resources and it's not leaving enough. Intermediate sized fish in the population. Sometimes you can use it to account for sex-specific growth, an example being that males don't get as large as females. So if you have a minimum length limit where these males can't get to it, perhaps you need to look at a harvest slot length limit to try to promote harvest of some of those fish and focus the harvest on those desired fish. Now, I mentioned there's infrequent use in freshwater fisheries. This is pretty common in harvest-oriented marine fisheries to maximize yield. When the objective of those fisheries is to maximize how many pounds of flesh can be harvested, these are often used. It can certainly create confusion with protected slot length limits despite addressing opposite objectives. And as I mentioned, it works by focusing this harvest on the abundant portion of the population to try to, I guess, flatten the curve has been a buzzword of late. Try to flatten that curve and push it out to more small and large fish. Ultimately, I guess the point that I want to make is that there's a lot that goes into our harvest regulations. And what I just quickly went through, like I said, it can be thought of as a framework. When our biologists are out sampling and they see these certain population characteristics, that's where their head goes to start thinking about which of these basic frameworks of harvest regulations would be most effective to get the population back where they wanted it. But that is just one consideration. I mean, there are other considerations, including angler desires, population potential, nearby angling opportunities, fishery history, recent changes, and about anything else you can think of. One thing that's constant is these regulations must be continually evaluated to ensure that we're meeting management goals. In a perfect world, we could set it and forget it, but things change. Angler desires change, populations change, forage bases change. All sorts of things can change, and we have to be adaptable. And another thing is all of these regulations require enforcement and they require angler compliance to be effective. The premise of a minimum length limit is that we're protecting these fish until they reach reproductive maturity. In a lot of instances, if those fish are illegally harvested, for example, same with the protected slot length limit. When we put on a protected slot length limit, a lot of times not a lot of times, every time we want harvest of those fish that are underneath that protected slot length limit. So if we don't get that harvest of those unders, then ultimately those protected slots function like a very large minimum length limit. And that's all that I have. Like I said, my intent here was just to kind of lay out and give a bit of a primer on some of these regulations. Just like every year, we're going to present some new regulations. And I guess I just wanted to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page on what some of them meant. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Anybody have? I see one deal with Marion Reservoir, but maybe we'll talk about that in a little bit, where we shuffle the size limits and try to enhance the fishery. I suspect there'll be some people pleased with the new recommendation. Any other comments? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nice job, sir.
Now, Doug, it's back to you.
Thanks, man. I hope that you found that helpful. We are experimenting with fine-tuning our regulations, and some of these new ideas with one over or two over the ability to harvest within a slot are things that we're wanting to try. And so today we're going to explain a little bit about some alternative regulations. And the first one we have up is Dave Stallsbury, district biologist in the Cedar Bluff area, is going to give a presentation, kind of give you an update of what's happened at Cedar since we implemented the 21-inch minimum length limit, and then where he would like to go for next year.
Thanks. I did kind of jump ahead. We have commercial bait regulations that
I'll come back and catch that when we get these presentations.
All right, that'll be fine then.
Okay, thanks, Doug. Thanks to the commission members. Again, I'm Dave Stallsbury, the district fisheries biologist in Cedar Bluff. And I'm proposing to maintain the 21-inch minimum length limit at Cedar Bluff and the 5-per-day creel limit. But in addition to that, I would like to embed within that regulation a 2-per-day, an option for anglers to keep 2 fish between 15 but less than 18 inches within that framework. So just kind of moving ahead here, and I think I'm going to have some.
Not clicking.
It's not moving, Jason. Am I supposed to aim somewhere special?
Aim it at Jason's head.
Right?
That's right.
Okay, that's still not happening, because I'm sure I'm looking right, but.
Should just be the arrows on the.
Yeah, that's what I think. I do have some data coming up, so I guess if anybody, I'm just gonna say it ahead of time, if anybody has questions about it at that point in time, it might be good to address it immediately, especially the commission folks here. But just a little background, prior to implementation of 21-inch minimum length limit, walleye harvest has been regulated with an 18-inch minimum length limit and 5 fish per day creel limit from 1989 to 2018. And during that time frame, really, the reservoir was really low in the late 80s, early 90s, and in the mid to late 90s, the reservoir began refilling, and this created ideal conditions for largemouth bass. And because of that, the walleye population was kind of ignored by the anglers, or the impetus was kind of taken away from the walleye population and kind of switched to largemouth bass. And a really quality largemouth bass population developed, but yet at the same time, the walleye were kind of operating under the radar, and a really good walleye population developed as well. To the point that there was a lot of large female collecting walleyes for culture purposes at Cedar Bluff, and we've been doing that from 2006 to the present, and interestingly, we've collected 3/4 of a billion eggs out of Cedar Bluff so far, so I'd say it's pretty important. Another interesting thing that kind of makes Cedar Bluff an anomaly is we do have fairly consistent, it still is variable like Ben was saying, but fairly consistent annual recruitment, and we haven't really had to rely on stocking. And I have data later that will show, that we kind of look at, that our probability of good year class formation, abundant year class formation, is independent of stocking and or removing walleye eggs from the fishery. So that's kind of interesting too. But more recently, and you folks will remember 4 years ago when I presented the last time, that our more recent sampling data has shown reduced abundance of larger individuals. And there's several events that kind of led into the decision to switch to the 21-inch minimum length limit. That led into implementing the 21-inch minimum length limit. But one in particular was the formation of a really strong 2014 year class. And that in tandem with the declining number of larger individuals, I thought it was a good time to protect them before they were harvested out, and they would give us a chance to kind of recuperate with decent growth, kind of the quality of the population that we had had before. And I also based that decision on some age and growth information that had been collected by a graduate student back in 2010 and 2011. We will see that later. And it indicated that at least by 3 years, we should see improvement. And if you're counting, this is year 4, there's been other incidents that has necessitated that we lengthen our evaluation period. But just going back, the 3 objectives for implementing the 21-inch minimum length limit was to improve the abundance of larger fish, and we would judge that through spring and fall sampling data. We also wanted to optimize the breeding population by having good numbers of large females and males present in the population, and then also kind of correlate that with our catch of young of the year fish in our fall nets. And optimizing the breeding population is important when the population is self-sustaining like that it is at Cedar Bluff, and then also to keep it relevant as a potential source for walleye eggs for culture purposes. That's another good thing to have too. The yield of walleye to the angler by improving the quality of the population. And like I said, further age and growth data indicated that at least by age 3 we should see improvement. So I subjected the 21-inch minimum length limit to a 3-year evaluation, and after that period, we would either maintain it or try something different. So that's what we're doing.
So did it work? First objective was to improve the abundance of larger fish. And let's see if I can find the point here. Oh, that is it. Okay, the data here on the left, that's fall sampling data, catching fish in the fall, and it's broken down by size. The black part of the bar is fish 10 to 18 inches, red part of the bar 18 to 21, and the gray part of the bar is 21 and larger. Okay, sorry about that. Having struggles with the technology. But what you can see is back in this period, strong numbers of larger individuals, but you can see about 2013 it really dropped. But yet at the same time, you can see that 2014 year class showing up here in 2015. They really increased the numbers of small fish and the numbers of fish overall. So also too, it's notable the 2019 data, you see a real decrease, and that was because of altered fish behavior, because they were searching other habitats for food. They were actually running really, really shallow, and they weren't catching in the gill nets, and we can talk a little bit more about that later. But then you also see in 2020, more normal sampling data and a little bit of improvement in that sector of 2021 fish. And then the data on the right is the spring stuff, and we've seen this before, it's just updated. But that trend line is of the percentage of the females that we're catching in the spring that's over 21 inches. That's the precipitous decline that I was concerned about. But you can also see at the end, they're at 19 and here in 2021, there was actually some improvement in the population where that's concerned. So we have seen some recovery in the population. So is there more bigger fish because of the 21 inch minimum? Yes. Okay, and then also another objective of the regulation was optimize the breeding population. So in a way, yeah, we have more bigger fish, which really means more female walleye in the population. So in that way, it's good. And it did improve, the percentage of females improved from 12% to 34% from 2019 to 21, respectively. But one problem we've seen is our recent recruitment index. We've seen a potentially suppressed recruitment. So we'll talk a little bit more about maybe why that is here in a little bit. But did it optimize the breeding potential? Maybe, but there's other factors that are in play as well that could be making it where it did not exactly do that. And then finally, did it increase angler yield? And I would say definitely no. 2014 was a pretty big year. I wish I could have run a creel survey in 2017. I think it would have been an even bigger year, but you can really see high angling pressure, and then anglers really wanted to fish for walleye. 42% of anglers interviewed were fishing specifically for walleye. The other thing you can see is they harvested a bunch and threw a bunch back, and the percent harvest rate, the percentage of the total fish that were harvested was almost a third of the fish caught were harvested. Now fast forward to the 2018 data, you see a reduction in angling pressure, which we expected, and walleye kind of fell off the map in terms of preference, and harvest was definitely reduced, and whether it be the total number of fish harvested and the total percentage of fish harvested. Fast forward another year to 2019, walleye were back on the map in terms of fishing pressure and percent preference, walleye specific angling pressure, but still a huge amount of catch and release, higher than any other year documented, very few fish harvested, and our percent harvest was under 3. So definitely where the 21 inch minimum length limit really failed was because what was improving that angler yield. So there's reasons for that. We'll get into those. And we had kind of a synergistic coming together of several consequential events. I've talked at length about that 2014 year class. So the fact that they increased walleye abundance so much, we tried to protect them so those fish were protected from harvest. And then we also had, the lake was in 2017 was probably about 28 feet below full pool. And in a year and a half time, over part of 2018, 2019, the reservoir came up 17 feet. So at the time, I thought, great, we're going to see excellent fish production. This is going to be a really good thing, and everything's going to hum right along. But lo and behold, as the year went on in 2019, come to find out, the shad production was horrible. I mean, like, phenomenally horrible. Yes, sir.
What happened? Why?
That's a really good question. Why? The only thing I can think is typically I do kind of start looking for shad early in the season by pulling a fry trawl. And a lot of times where I find the larval shad is at the far west end of the lake, at the upper end of the lake, and at the upper ends of the major coves, the large coves. Well, with the lake being down, those coves grew up to that common reed, Phragmites, and that stuff, when the lake came up, flooded, and it grew. And I mean, it grew. It was able to get above the water surface in 13 foot of water, but anything deeper died and had to decay. Well, that year, there was just a lot of the lake basin that had that decomposition going on. And I think in those nursery habitats for young deer gizzard shad, they weren't very mobile at the point in time, or they were just eggs at that point in time when the weather started to warm up in June and the dissolved oxygen went away and killed them, or at least a lot of them, because we went back to 2020. Well, we went up there in 2019, and it smells like a new lake when it refills, has that funky decomposition odor, and we did pull dissolved oxygen samples, and it was 0. And there was, the only fish that were up there was stuff like common carp that are really low dissolved oxygen. Tolerant
environment, yeah.
So I think that's the best explanation. But bottom line is, it was terrible shad production. And so you see what you see on the fish on the right, emaciated fish. And this is an extreme example, a very extreme example, but on the whole, fish looked tough. So what we saw was reduced growth. We saw reduced recruitment, I think, because of just competition and poor body condition, poor gonad population recovery that we're looking for when we implemented the 21-inch minimum. So yeah, it's these three things: protecting abundant fish, and then having the floor fall out from underneath in terms of forage production was kind of a disaster in 2019. But things have flip-flopped in 2020, 2021, and we may talk about that a little bit later too. But just looking at reduced growth, the figure on the left is that growth from 2010, 2011. That's the growth I based my recommendation to move to the 21-inch minimum length limit on. And then as part of the evaluation, I did extensive age and growth work on walleye as well. This is for male walleye, mind you. It's data from 2017 to 2019, and the red dots is basically the average, the mean lengthed age, and then all the black dots are just to give you an idea of variability. That's individual lengthed age of each fish that was aged in the data set. So you can see in male walleye, they jump up to 10 inches in their first year, about 15 inches their second year. Then their growth starts to taper off, but they get close to 20, 21 inches by age 7. One thing you will notice with the males is don't see too many males over 9 years old, and then those year classes at age 7 and 8 are kind of starting to thin out. But then you look at the data from 2017 also, you see that same kind of longevity pattern, but you really see a flattening of the curve right in here. They're not getting quite as big, and that curve's flattening. They're still growing decent down here, but you're getting a flattened curve kind of once they start getting larger. So that's notable. Moving on to female walleye, same data, same stuff, just females. Again, they jump to 10 inches their first year, 15 inches their second year, and by age 3 at Cedar Bluff during that time frame, they were pushing 20 inches. So that's where I thought, the 21-inch minimum would be great. But you look at the data from 2017, 2019, compared to that 2010, 2011 data, there's a lot of difference. And again, we see this major flattening right here. And this flattening corresponds with basically the recruitment of that 2014 year class. So essentially we had exceeded carrying capacity, and we had increased interspecific competition for food, and we had slower growth within that period. But the positive is that the small fish are still growing relatively rapidly, and there are reasons for that too, in that they're relying on a different forage resource. Moving on. And again, because of this poor condition, black food situation, we're seeing reduced recruitment. And this is just long-term catch data from 79 to essentially present, showing the number of young deer walleye caught per net on average. And we usually consider 5. Red bars are stocking years, so again, you can see kind of there's a chance you get a good year class when you stock, and maybe not, and then you also see that with non-stocking years too. But the big thing is that you see 13, and there's that 14-year class, and then you see the last 3 years, pretty low numbers there. So there could be a possible density-dependent situation going on with recruitment at Cedar Bluff. I strongly suspect that. And then again, delayed recovery. This is basically comparing, the graph is just comparing, that's the 2010, 2011 mean length of age compared to mean length of age in the black line for 2014 females. So the older what do we do? To scale back to a 15-inch minimum length limit or an 18-inch minimum length limit, there would be an awful lot of fish harvested, and provided they can catch them. This year's been a tougher walleye fishing year because the fish have plenty to eat, and we may touch on that a little bit later. But it would pretty much devastate the population as we know it now if we were to scale back to some of those smaller length limits. So with a 5 per day creel limit. So what I'm proposing is kind of based on some of these tenets here. Male walleye reach sexual maturity around 15 inches at Cedar Bluff at age 2. They can reach 18 inches, but at that point, natural mortality's already started to whittle on them. And then very, very few reach 21 inches at Cedar Bluff, but it is possible as early as age 6. On the other hand, female walleye, they mature about 19 inches at Cedar Bluff, and around age 3, and they reach 21 in good, what I call good growing conditions by age 4 or 5. And they generally live longer, and that's why you see those fish out to 27, 28, 29 inches. Those are females. But because of this disparity, really the 18-inch minimum length limit or the 21-inch minimum length limit focuses hardest on basically only females almost. So the males, for the most part, are an underutilized resource just sitting out there, especially with those higher length limits. But again, we're in a very extremely variable environment with the water level variability at Cedar Bluff. That has so much to do with all the variability in terms of forage production, recruitment production. And so we can have these crazy years where we get a big year class or we have no forage production. And so we're dealing with that. And then also too, when we did our 2018 creel survey, Susan Steffen, our human dimension specialist, she created some special questions asking about angler support or lack thereof for the 21-inch minimum. And basically about 40% supported it strongly, 40% strongly opposed, and about 20% were neutral. So I have a very dipolar or very polar constituency that's, some folks are just wanting to catch and eat walleye, and other people have more of a mentality of wanting to be a steward of the walleye resource and look for the kind of longer-term sustainability. So that complicates things a bit. So basically, what I'm proposing is it's just an experimental regulation where we would maintain the 21-inch minimum length of it, but we'd embed what I'm calling the harvest exception within that framework to allow anglers to keep up to 2 fish from 15 but less than 18 inches long. This has been well covered. This definitely differs from our typical thinking when we think of slot length limit in Kansas. Normally we think of slot length limit protected, slot, and thinning those fish below, but with the variable nature of recruitment at Cedar Bluff, that's not exactly probably the right way to go. So with what I'm protecting, it would be more of a situation where we protect in our first kind of protected length range from 0 to 15 inches. We would protect juvenile male and juvenile female walleye, and we would also protect young, mature males as well. So we'd be protecting that segment of the population. Keep some males in the population to promote natural recruitment. Then we would have kind of our, what I call the harvest exception, which is our first harvest length range from 15 but less than 18 inches. And we'd allow up to 2 fish in that length range to be harvested per day. And essentially what this would do, this would impact or impart harvest primarily on larger, older male walleye and make use of a once underutilized resource under the 18 or the 21 inch minimum length on it. And it would subject younger juvenile or older juvenile females to almost mature females to harvest. But with normal growth, those female walleye grow through that 15 to 18 inch length range so quickly that they probably would be subject to harvest for up to 1 season, or probably even less. So their probability of being harvested versus the male would be much, much lower. And then we have our second kind of protected length range from 18 up to 21 inches. And that essentially, again, going back, our females usually start maturing at 19 inches of range, or 19 inches of length on average. And so basically we'd be protecting a segment of the mature female population, kind of like that lower protected length range does for the males. And then from there on up, the anglers could go ahead and fill out their 5 per day bag if they could catch a fish over 21 inches. So it would provide a unique angling opportunity in the state, and that's kind of what we're trying to do with the walleye initiative. I've retained the 15, 18, and 21 inch length benchmarks because, one, they're familiar to the anglers. 2, the 15 and 18 are biologically meaningful in terms of the age of maturity for male and female walleye. And then the reducing that creel limit in that harvest exception would allow some harvest of an underutilized segment of the population as far as the males are concerned, but it's done at a reduced range. And so it would hopefully have less impact on the overall population density as a whole and limit the harvest of juvenile females. So this length limit would be, this tweak to the length limit would be similar in terms of objectives of the 21, improving large fish, optimizing breeding potential, and improving the yield of walleye harvested to anglers. Again, it is definitely experimental, and therefore I would again subject it to a 3-year evaluation period. But we've also talked to, if we see something disastrous coming down the road, we may alter course even before that 3-year period's over. But it definitely would satisfy the desires of the more polar angling constituency that fish at Cedar Bluff for walleye. And then at the same time, it would more discreetly target harvest to allow some harvest of males and also females, and not just strictly shift all the harvest on the females. And it would also, I'm kind of counting on the population and the angling pressure to be somewhat self-regulating in that what we're seeing now, what we saw in 2019 when the fish were hungry in the first part of 2020 is the fish were starving and they'd bite a bare hook. So anglers were going out catching 30, 50, 100 walleye in a day. It was, crazy. And now this year they've got all the food, their ideal size food, like I'll show here, the shad this year. Well, they're produced in 2020 and they carried over. And those walleye, as soon as they were done spawning and kind of recovered a little bit, began feeding. They started feeding on the shad immediately, and their conditions totally different. I mean, they look totally better. So if you have a deficit of forage, you might need to harvest some fish because there's not as much food out there. The fish would be more willing. So, that's where allowing some harvest is a good thing. But at the same time, when the fish have plenty to eat, they're harder to catch. The environment can survive them, so why not leave them in the system to grow some more? So that's what I mean, an example of what I mean by self-regulating. And then also kind of just under the banner of our Kansas Walleye Initiative, it'll just increase, we try to kind of geographically provide more walleye handling diversity, and this will definitely do that. So in summary, and there's this vision shad I was talking about on the left. There's the 2020 cohort. They're about 4 to 6 inches long. They grew really quick, overwintered really well. That's an example one of the walleye from this spring that we caught during electrofishing. Their body condition is night and day different than it was a year ago. So they look really good. But going back, by embedding this 15 but less than 18 2 per day harvest exception within the framework of the 21-inch minimum length and then 5 per day creel limit, it'll protect both some males and females to maintain a brood fish sector in the population. It will better meet the harvest desires of kind of a diverse constituency, and then it will also integrates conservation but allows harvest in an environment like Cedar Bluff that's extremely variable and leads to extremely variable walleye recruitment and forage availability. So that's all I got, and I would gladly take questions at this point. Thank you.
Dave?
Yes.
We've met for Ted Webster, president of Kansas Walleye Association.
Can you come to the microphone?
First of all,
Can you come to the mic, please?
yes. I'm probably going to talk a little bit through this section. I hope you guys don't mind. I'm going to try to speed this up and be as short and brief as possible. Again, my name is Ted Webster, Kansas Walleye Association president. I've met Lauren, you're from my hometown, obviously. Troy, we visited a little bit. Some of you others we have in the past, I'm sure. You know, I wanted to first of all tip my hat to you because I know you dealt with some incredible environmental situations as you kind of briefly touched on with your shad-based crashing. The one thing I wanted to come up here and say is at least for the first time in my 40 years plus of walleye fishing, we see some outside the box thinking. The Kansas Walleye Association for the last 30 years has data to back up what I'm sitting here talking about, in that some of these, you know, implementations that we're putting in right now have been needed for a long, long time. You know, as Craig Johnson back there, you know, I'm going to take the words out of his mouth, said, you know, we've been trying to deal with walleye basically with a sledgehammer rather than a scalpel. And we needed a scalpel. And unfortunately, you had to deal with this bureaucracy that you have to deal with, because if you could have managed, because we visited earlier, you knew your shad population had crashed. But by the time we get around to actually being able to do something about it, it's too late. We know the health of your fish are good. We've had a tournament there this year. Your health are good. One of the reasons why I wanted to visit is why, and I want to ask you this and be honest with me, why are we allowing still 5 a day over 21? You know people aren't going to catch 21-inch fish out of your lake right now. You know that those numbers are down. Is it to placate? Is it to appease those people, that 40% of the people that you mentioned about? Because if it's for appeasement, then it's for the wrong reason. What we need to do is trust you to do your job, to do it correctly, and go with your recommendations. But please explain to me why we're allowing still 5 per day when you and I both know you're not going to catch 5 21-inch fish out of it. And so why not just limit that to 1 per day and stay with the rest of your regulations, which we completely agree with and think are great. So I'm not being critical here, sure, but I need an answer.
Sure, and I'll give you an answer. And Ted, I do appreciate your kind comments, and it's a great question. And you know, part of the answer you may not want to hear, but through the management that we've been doing at Cedar Bluff, you know, we have a local constituency that we don't stop. We take eggs out, and now we make it harder to catch illegal fish. And it's take, always taking. So really, from a sociological standpoint, I thought to take more from them by limiting the creel limit, it would just be one more thing that it would you know, stir up a lot of controversy. So, and like you just stated, you know they're not going to catch 5 21-inch fish, so why does it matter?
Right, exactly. And so my point is, right, it is going to, I talked with Lynn down right. But, you know,
from a business standpoint, if it doesn't matter, then why not from a sociological standpoint, leave well enough alone.
Right, and I agree with that wholeheartedly. And Lynn and I visited, I feel like I know a lot of people, Doug's back there. You know, I'm not here to be critical other than the fact that we are let me just baseline. Across the state over the last 30 years, our catch rates, and I have the data to back it up, that our tournaments have done nothing but a steady decline. We have to change that. Two things need to happen. Either we need to put in more fishing, and Ben, is Ben still here? He got up here and gave a really good presentation. One thing I disagree with you, well, I agree, but I struggle with, is that you said that even if we stop, those stockings don't take place the way we want them to. Mother Nature is involved. We have issues. The problem is we can't stop doing it. And in fact, we have to increase. Doug, we had a nice I want to see that goal increased. My anglers who are coming to me upset right now because we've seen a 30-year slide, both catch rate and also size rate in our tournaments statewide, because we travel all over the state. We want to see that number boosted. Need should help. That's what I understand. But back to your initial point, and I don't want to get too far off base, is I don't want to manage things reactively. I want to do it proactively. Sure. We have a problem with Wilson right now. I don't want to get into that. I mean, you know, but in your particular lake, it may not matter right now, but if what you and I both know will happen, your fish are healthy, number one right now. You have great shad population. That growth rate's going to explode. That we originally wanted to protect in the first place. Now, Lynn told me we're on a 3-year plan, so I'm only begging and hoping that when your lake gets right, that then we can go ahead and get back to where we need to be to protect those females.
Sure,
and,
sure. Well, and Lynn's totally right, and and maybe I didn't emphasize it well enough. If we need to make a change quickly, we can, through the Secretary's order process, we can do something in short order if we feel like we need to.
And that's why I felt I needed to come today, because I want to back you 100%. And I need the commissioners to understand that we are in agreement for the first time in many, many years that we are seeing some changes off minimum length limits, 15, 18, 21. The other thing that I wanted to make very clear, and so the commissioners know, and we visited about this, is our harvest right now is incredible. Statewide, our harvest of this species of fish, and I know you guys got many things to deal with, prairie chickens, everything else. Why I came here, walleye, the harvest is incredible. I would love to see more of the 3 fish, 2 fish per day. If we don't do that, we're going to crash walleye populations. 2 things need to happen in our opinion, our association's opinion. Number 1, we have to increase stocking. And number 2, we have to decrease harvest at many of our lakes. Those are the points I wanted to make. I wanted to drive it home as quickly as I could. I want to thank you for looking outside of the box, and Craig's going to have a presentation here in a little bit. But again, I thank him. I work hand in hand with many of these people. I say that phone to phone many times. But I want to thank you for what you're doing, and I don't want the results of your study to look like you've done a poor job because of an environmental deal, because I know that you care about your walleye population, and we appreciate it. We just need to see more of it. And these 2 gentlemen that are getting ready to talk, we appreciate, and I will get off this mic, and thank you for giving me your time. And I did not mean to interrupt that, but I wanted to get that straight. So thank you very much.
Any other questions, comments?
So what's going to trigger you putting more walleye in Cedar Bluff?
What's going to trigger me to put
to stock?
Well, I would like a good way to evaluate the stocking.
Excuse me?
I would like a good way to evaluate the stocking. And I think the Emporia guys are on the case right now with the photo microchemistry work. I'm super hopeful I guess I don't like to just throw the kitchen sink at stuff and just whatever sticks, sticks. Our hatchery systems only have X amount of capacity. We only have so many days, to do things, and we want to strive for efficiency. Well, if we're just throwing resources at something, don't know if it's working, then it seems counterintuitive. So I guess I want to know that it's working if the microchemistry technology shows itself work, I'd be more than glad to try some experimental sockets of walleye and cedar bluff.
Dave, explain that real quick, the tracking system with microchemistry.
Basically they remove the otolith from the fish, and the otolith is a bony structure in the skull of the fish that grows throughout the fish's life. And it's like adding layers of bone to an onion. And the longer it builds that bone based on the ions that are in the water. Different waters have different ion concentrations. And because of that, you can identify, if we know the baseline concentrations of certain ions in certain waters, and we can identify whether probability that came from this water or this water or this water. And so the Minnesota River water that they raise in the Pratt fish hatchery, we know that microchemistry or strontium, barium, and whatever they're looking at in there. So if we see that little signature on the otolith, we can know, oh yeah, it was
stock versus natural.
Probably came from Pratt versus being in Cedar Bluff water. Good question.
Any other questions? The only thing I might add is that if it doesn't affect the resource, sociological perspective, sociological reasons for setting certain rules is a good idea sometimes. If it doesn't make any difference, nobody's going to harvest them. You'll be able to act quick enough if it becomes an over harvest and it makes people feel better. And it probably didn't hurt anything. Any other questions? All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Dave.
Okay, so next up is Craig Johnson. He's the fisheries biologist that's in charge at Marion Reservoir. He put together a novel approach to walleye management. He's going to give you an update on the status of the length limit change at Marion Reservoir.
All right, thank you, Doug. Good afternoon to Chairman Lauber and Commissioners. Good to be here. I was last at the commission meeting back in August of 2019, so this will be a little bit of a recap of that. I'll try to run through it pretty quick, but I can get that up here. Thanks, Jason. Just clicker. There we go with the clicker boards. Ta-da. Going back to what we talked about in August of 2019 was a 2020 and beyond plan for Marion Reservoir and to change the walleye length limits, walleye management at that impoundment. It was a 4-year pilot study. We're still holding to that. The first part of that was to change to a 21-inch minimum length limit and run that through 20 and 21. And the other part of that was to allow harvest of 18-inch fish again starting in 20 and 22. So we're halfway through that now. Part of the plan was to conduct creel surveys to monitor the pressure, catch rates, harvest, and catch size structure of the walleye there. The COVID pandemic has kind of compromised some of our plans with the creel surveys, but we still intend to do the creel surveys for next year, which would be the harvest phase coming into it. Of course, continue with our standardized sampling to monitor the population, what changes we're seeing with these different regulations going on, and obviously collect input from our anglers to see if it's something that's worth doing and if they're liking what we're doing with it. It was a new approach. It hasn't been done in Kansas intentionally anyways, but it's to utilize growth phases and harvest phases to improve walleye harvest size, as well as also improve our brood fish there at the lake as well. So growth phase contains more restrictive harvest regulations to provide protection for one or more growing season. And on the flip side of that, the harvest phase contains less restrictive harvest regs to allow harvest fish that were previously protected during the grow phase. Quick recap of what we've had at Marion for quite a while. Before 1989, there was no minimum length limit in an 80-day creel. Starting in 1989, a 5-a-day creel was put on the lake. I think that was statewide at the time. And in 1992 through 2019, we've operated under an 18-inch minimum length limit and a 5-a-day creel. And then in January of 2020, with the first grow phase coming in, there was a 21-inch minimum length limit, and we retained that 5-a-day creel at that time. Going back, a little history on this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. 1987 to 2020, big takeaways on these. Those red bars, those are the years that Marion was stocked. So I think the first ones, I can't see it now, 87, 88 on the far left, stocked again in 92 and 93. And then from 93 to 2016, the lake was not stocked at all. So we always talk about Marion being naturally recruiting, capable of natural production and everything. So from 92 to 16, nothing happened. So we stocked 16, 17, and 18. The first 2 years were walleye fry. We were able to put in about 80,000+ fingerlings in the third year of that stocking. The other key takeaway there is that blue line. Put the trend line on there. Like I was talking about just a little bit ago about density dropping over time. That's happened at Marion. And that was some of the decline that we were seeing where anglers were starting to get a little more concerned about it. So that's when we started to think we ought to look and see what's going on and see if we could hopefully reverse some of that. The other part of that is you get down to the year of 2010, we changed up the way that we sample walleye populations as fisheries biologists. It was a statewide change. So most of that other data was pretty consistent as far as the way it was collected. So basically the far right side of this graph may not be completely accurate. So we're going to look at it this way. This will be the last about 11 years of fall test netting for walleye at El Dorado. At Marion, you can see it's a little more promising than just a downward trend going on there. So those blue bars is our stock catch per unit of effort. That's basically, you can look at is that as the density of the fish in the lake. The other interesting part is those little green bars that's on there. Those are our young of the year or age 0, or the walleye that hatched the same year that we sampled them. Reason that's interesting, we talk about stocking and everything, the variability of stocking success and everything. If you look at the 3 years that we've stocked recently, 16, 17, and 18, the only year that we saw young of the year fish show up in the fall test netting sample was the first year that we stocked fry. The other 2 years that you see there on the far right, I know the numbers look pretty small from here on that, but that was the 19 and 20 data. So those green bars that are showing up there were not a result of stocking because we didn't stock those. That was natural recruitment. So again, we talk about the floods, how that increased the production of most of our game fish at Marion during the big floods. Record high water levels provided a lot of quality fish habitat and everything there, but our walleye production without stocking was very good those 2 years there. So these are ridgeline plots, and it's a quick way to look at length, frequency, distributions of your walleye populations over a long period of time. So there's 10 or 11 years of fish data there. The first thing to look at is the brighter colors equate to more fish that we sampled that year. So higher densities during that year. So it's advantageous to see those brighter colors. It's length frequency, so there's shorter fish on the left side of this, and there's bigger fish on the right side. So as you scroll across there looking left to right, they get bigger as you go to the right. The two vertical lines in there, the first one shows where the 18-inch length would be, and then the one to the right of that would be the 21. So just a quick look at this is just to show the variability that our anglers see when they go out there to fish. You know, some years like 2017, when it's that fourth one up from the bottom, pretty bright blue color. That means lots of fish, but there's a lot of fish that were over that 18-inch mark. So you go out there with an 18-inch minimum length limit that Marion had for 27 years. An angler could expect or catch, have a very good opportunity of having a pretty good day out there, not only just catching, but also taking some fish home. And then you look at some of the other years, there's not very many fish between those two. So what we're trying to do is make that a little bit better for the anglers, and at the same time provide more fish to the far right of that. In the reservoir, so increase it a little bit on the far right side as well. Get a lot of questions about how's it working so far. We sample our walleye in the fall, so our first 21-inch minimum length limit went in for January 20th. I've looked at those fish once with nets, and at that time the limit had only been on for about 9 months. We're out there in October, November, so that hadn't even been a year that was on there. So what we're seeing in the net so far this early into it isn't real impressive or anything. So what I'm looking at is talking to the anglers out at the lake and kind of getting reports from them as far as what they're seeing in year 2 of the 21-inch length limit. And the reports are pretty good. We've got high numbers of fish in that 15 to 17-inch range that are being caught. And that's most likely those fish that were the flood fish that were produced in 2019. We've got very good numbers of 18 to 20-inch walleye. That's good to see too. Of course, when you have an 18-inch minimum length limit, those fish are getting harvested, obviously, with the 21 being on there for 2 years. We've got more of those. And the very good part of it is kind of the timing of when we started this back and proposed it in 2019. We had a pretty good, I'll say, perfect storm kind of setting up as well, because we had some fish set up to get over that 21-inch mark to be available for that. And the other good side of that is the fish are in excellent body condition. There's lots of food in there. Marion's a very fertile lake. Normally not much problems with having plenty for everybody to eat in there. So they're good numbers, a good fat, healthy fish as well. The proposed walleye harvest regulation harvest phase, which would start in January of 2022, would be going back to an 18-inch minimum length limit, modifying the creel limit to a 3-a-day creel limit with 1 fish per day, 21 inches or longer. And looking at how that would be graphically, I guess here, an angler could go out there and have 2 fish that was over 18 but less than 21, and 1 fish over 21, or an angler could have all 3 of his fish between 18 and 21. And the objectives of this would be, again, to return to the harvest of 18-inch walleye. That was a big thing too. A lot of times when we put 21-inch length limits on, first thing I hear from anglers is, well, it'll never go back because you guys never change your stuff back. But big thing with this was to do what we said what we were going to do. We want to provide increased size of harvested walleye. Again, a lot of times with an 18-inch or any minimum length limit over time, you'll see those fish start getting cropped off. Especially walleye, they're highly harvested. Few of the legal fish get released again. And a lot of fish, might just be a quarter or ½ inch over that minimum length limit. So we're wanting to provide a little bit better opportunity for bigger fish instead of just ones that are within a ½ inch of the minimum length limit. We want to increase the brood fish numbers to supplement that natural recruitment. Again, when we get into brooders and the fish that are capable of that, Dave touched on the specifics of that out at Cedar Bluff and the sizes of those fish. But a lot of the big ones, the important sizes of walleye at these lakes, are 21-inch plus walleye. So we want to increase those fish to hopefully boost our numbers back up and get more of those green bars showing up on that other graph instead of just once every couple of years, which goes back to thinking about our rather sporadic recruitment that we do get, and even with stockings. Stockings don't guarantee that we're going to have those, and we can't always rely on 100-year flood events to make a population pop on that. We want to extend the quality fishing opportunity with the reduced daily creel. There's a little bit of concern about what you might call the opening day syndrome or something. We used to see that as an agency years ago when we'd renovate state fishing lakes back in the day before the fishing regulations were a little bit more restrictive. But some of the biologists had worked on these waters for 4, 5, 6 years and renovate them, maybe not 6 years. But once they were open with the less restrictive limits, the public could go in and hit them pretty hard, and before long, it was kind of back where it started was before. So we want to extend that quality fishing opportunity and stretch things out just a little bit. And I also want to provide anglers with increased catch rates of larger fish while also allowing fish for the table. And with that, I would take any questions.
Does anybody have any questions? I think that'll be that change to 18 is going to be pretty popular.
Should be.
I've got some feedback on that. And so, well, if there's no other questions, Doug, you.
Thanks, Craig.
Thank you.
Keep up.
I wish to thank the presenters for the excellent presentations. I think it's going to help set the stage for what we're going to be talking about going into next year. Now we're ready to actually talk about the regulation changes that we are proposing for next year. And I think I need to step back just a minute and reflect a little bit, because we had a major change in our fisheries division, and that came last Friday on Kyle Austin, our assistant director of our fisheries division, retired last week. And Kyle is the one that has been the one that takes all of the fishing regulation requests that come in each year, takes them to our regulation committee, and then makes the final decision on what staff recommendations are going to be. So I want to thank Kyle for his many years of service. He worked for the department for over 35 years. And so we're really going to miss him. And this is the last little bit of work that he did on regulations that we're going to be discussing today. Referred to several times, but just a quick update. Our intent of the walleye initiative was options with different management goals across the state. Some places we're managing with smaller lead limits and higher harvest. Some places we're protecting brood stock for the hatchery supply. Other places we're providing improved quality and trophy fishing. And so I think we've done a good job in trying to provide geographic options across the state for walleye anglers. And then the other part of our walleye initiative was to improve our stocking program. And it is a challenge. So that 92 million egg goal that we had this year was what we start off with each year. We look at all the requests that come in for fry fingerlings and advanced size of walleye, and then we determine how many eggs it's going to take to reach that goal based upon a relatively conservative hatch rate. And so oftentimes we might have to get more than our initial goal if the hatch rates are actually lower. But in a good year like this year, we had a really good hatch rate, and we did not have to collect the full 92 million to meet the demand. And that demand is built largely by the district biologists. They put the requests in, they tell us how many they want of each size, and then the hatchery system does their best to meet that demand. That said, though, we still struggle each year to meet the stocking demand for all species, and so we have to make decisions each year on what we're not going to raise. But we've always made it a priority for species that are in high demand, such as walleye, largemouth bass, some of our catfish species. Those are species that our stocking programs focus a lot of effort and time on, because those are the ones that have become known to us to be the most important to the anglers. So it's a challenge, and one of the things we're working on right now is expanding the capability of our hatcheries to raise more and bigger walleye, to give us better options to manage these fisheries and to do what we want to do with that initiative, which is to satisfy the needs of the walleye anglers out there. We're already well underway at Milford Hatchery with raising fingerlings to larger sizes on an artificial diet. I was up there earlier this week, and we have, I think, about 40,000, 45,000 advanced fingerlings inside the building right now, with the goal of getting those to 8 or 9 inches by the end of the year. We have a new building under construction at Mead Hatchery. It's going to be a recirculating aquaculture system that will have the potential to be able to produce about 300,000 to 400,000 fingerlings each year, and also raise about another 70,000 intermediate size 8 and 9 inch walleye each year. So that'll be good. We're having some problems with the construction. We've had some engineering problems and some design flaws that have delayed the construction process, and it's looking more and more like it's going to be hard to have this thing ready to go next spring like we hoped. We're still hopeful that we can rally, get the engineers and the construction crews back on track, and still have the ability to get everything set up and make our first attempt to raise walleye in there next year. But we're at a breaking point here. If it takes much longer, I'm afraid we're not going to be able to use that next year. So anyway, the walleye initiative, I think, has done well. We're well into the development of this program. And we continue to seal off. We've had a lot of ponds that weren't usable. We've had to go in and seal ponds like at Mead, and we're working on sealing other ponds. Try to put as many ponds in production as we can to raise more fingerlings as well. So with the combination of more pond space, a new building at Mead, a revamped peak training program at the Milford Hatchery, we're going to be getting a lot further down the road on meeting that demand than what we've been able to do in the past. So with that, I think the next step that we want to get into the regulation changes that came from staff. And the first one up is going to be Chris Steffen talking about changes to the commercial bait regulations for next year.
Good afternoon. The change we are proposing is to 115.17.2, commercial sale of fish bait. Right now, the regulation specifically lists that you can sell dead shad. We are requesting to add additional species to clarify that Asian carp, including silver and bighead carp, skipjack herring, emerald shiners, threadfin shad, and then any additional legally obtained species of wildlife to be sold to that list. We're just trying to make it a little more clear what those bait shops can sell as far as dead bait. I'll take any questions if you have any.
Are there any questions on any questions? Well, I guess that's simple enough. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I guess what I was going to, do we have skipjack herring in Kansas?
You want to answer that?
No. Maybe one wander up the Missouri River at some point, but no, it's a commonly available commercial product.
What about thin shad?
Redfin?
Redfin.
The threadfin shad, I think we talked to you a while back, but I'm not sure that any of those remain at this point.
They winter kill. We have used them for enhancing the forage base. Some places where gizzard shad aren't doing well, you stock them, knowing that they're probably not going to survive their winter. And then so it's a tool to enhance forage. We've done a little bit of that, and we might do more in the future, but it's not a species that can do well in Kansas.
Thank you.
We have put some in the seed lake, the power plant lake down there, and there probably was some carryover. But even down there, if they shut the plant down in the wintertime and it gets cold, they're gone. So, any other questions on that? Okay, now we're ready to move into what we call our reference document. That's the regulations that differ from the statewide length and creel limits for the most part. And the reference document changes that we've had so far for this year. There's several, 2 or 3, I think, that are probably of importance to the commissioners, and some of them are relatively minor, but we'll go through the list here. And first one, I think, is one that's going to get a lot of attention, is going to be to allow the harvest of 10 per day with only one over 30 inches. We're trying to liberalize that population in terms of harvest. We've been protecting it, allowing those fish to reach sexual maturity and start to see natural recruitment. And we've seen results there. I talked to the staff that was up here last week even, collecting fish and tagging fish, and that population is doing really well. So we're ready to let anglers start benefiting with this regulation change. And I think Eli is on the call. If you have any questions, if I can't answer them, I'm sure Eli and John Rinke can, if anybody has any questions about the Tuttle Creek proposal. Okay, if not, then we're ready to move down to the one we just discussed, the Marion Reservoir change back to an 18-inch length limit and a 3-a-day creel limit with only one creel limit of fish over 21 inches for walleye. And since we've covered that, I don't know if there's any more questions regarding Craig's proposal. If not, we'll move down to the Cedar Bluff proposal that Dave shared with us with the exception slot that we talked about. Maintain the 21-inch minimum length limit to 5 per day on walleye, except that 2 fish 15 inches but less than 18 inches may be included in the daily creel. Any questions, any more questions about that proposal?
What I hear from the locals at Cedar is they really like what they're going to do at Marion with 3 fish, only one over 21. There's a lot of push for that too. So.
Okay. That's something we can have a discussion with staff, and if that's something the commission would like us to look into, we could have those conversations. Next one we have these are some community lakes and some smaller bodies of water. Bartlett City Lake, adding a 15-inch minimum length limit and 5-a-day creel on channel catfish. Parsons West Pond, add a 15-inch minimum length limit and 5-a-day creel on channel catfish. Bone Creek Reservoir in southeast Kansas, we're changing from a 13 to 18-inch slot. Largemouth bass and a 5-a-day creel on sawhead at that lake. I think we've had some issues with largemouth bass virus that has led to the need to try to protect that bass population a little bit more than what we were with the slot length limit.
Doug?
Yes.
I had a call. Was that the saw guy is contributing to the decrease of good bass fishing. Their tournaments have gone down. They're catching less fish and less good.
Reply to that if you wouldn't mind coming up. He knows more about that than I do, so.
We've been seeing some comments as well on that. The age of Bone Creek is part of the problem. It's an older reservoir now. You know, it's been online for 25, 30 years. So we're seeing a little bit of that aging, lower productivity. We saw some of this in our sampling as it was coming along already. Connor Osowski is the district biologist down there. He made a recommendation. He actually started requesting fingerling stockings for largemouth bass to help that population. And then removing the 13 to 18 inch slot, we're just protecting what we're stocking to get up to tournament angler satisfied size. The saw guy was stocked by the biologist that Connor replaced. Did an excellent job in helping the sunfish populations that were there. Crappie, redder, sunfish, bluegill in particular have all showed increased size structure because of saugeye predation. We do not believe that the saugeye are really contributing to any negative impact to the largemouth population, but we know we do have this population established now. Anglers are throwing crankbaits for largemouth. They're also catching saugeye, so we know we have some people out there that are upset with the saugeye population. And we're looking at doing different things like expanding the creel on it from 2 to 5.
Okay, so this was at, saugeye was at 2 and now it's looking to go to 5.
It'll go to 5
okay.
for next year. Yes.
Okay, good deal. Thank you.
All right, moving down the list, Parsons Total Creek Pond at a 15-inch minimum length limit and 5-a-day creel on channel catfish. Wichita KDOT West at a 21-inch minimum length limit and 2-a-day creel limit on saugeye. Sedgwick County Lake Afton changed to a 21-inch minimum length limit on wipers. And Harvey County Lake East changed to an 18-inch minimum length limit on largemouth bass. And those are the changes to our length and creel limits we're proposing for next fishing season as it sits today.
Any questions for Doug on that? Or you want to move on?
Okay, the next thing we have is changes to 11525-14, which are the trout stocking locations for Colby Villa High, Mineland Wildlife Area, and Sherman Smoky Gardens Lake. Colby Villa High and Sherman County Smoky Gardens Lake are two lakes that were just recently renovated, and they are in the trout program. And the locals are really excited about the trout fishing opportunities out there in that part of the state where fishing is opportunity very limited. And we've talked to the communities about the fact that we feel that during the trout season, everybody that's out there fishing should have a trout permit. And that's what this red change would do, would be require folks fishing at those locations. We also included the Mineland Wildlife Area trout pit as well as changing it to a type 1 water as well. Anybody have any questions about the change to a type 1 for those 3 lakes?
Type 1, you have to have a permit. Type 2, you can just fish.
Yeah, you don't need it.
You don't need one, but if you
besides trout, and therefore we didn't want to penalize people that still wanted to fish there but didn't want to fish for trout. And in these cases, it's primarily trout fisheries that are drawing people during the trout season. Okay, and then the last one I have is this is a kind of a companion to the youth mentor program that the wildlife folks are doing, where they're setting up the youth age for the under 18 to be taking advantage of youth mentor activities. We have youth mentor ponds around the state that currently, for an adult to be fishing there, they have to have a child under 16 to be able to be fishing on a youth mentor area. And to be consistent with how we're handling youth mentor issues between hunting and fishing, we're proposing to raise that to under 17. So if somebody's fishing on one of these youth mentor fishing locations, an adult can be there only if they're accompanying someone under age 18. It'd be a change on all the existing youth mentor trout water, or youth mentor fishing locations that we have.
Okay, are there any questions on that?
If not, I think that's it.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.
I think that's the end of the afternoon agenda. So what we're going to do is recess, and then we'll reconvene at 6:30. Thank you all. Thank all the presenters. I'll see you at 6:30.